Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of Irish Breakdown Podcast. My name is Brian Driscoll. I am the publisher at irishbreakdown.com. And that guy over there, that guy right there, is Vince D'Addario. He is our football analyst at irishbreakdown.com. And Vince, today we are together. We're going to talk as we sort of continue our summer countdown to the 2021 season.
Yeah.
Today we're going to talk about whether or not Notre Dame should be considered a national title contender 2021. And then I'm going to make the case, and we've talked about it, but you haven't necessarily given your full opinion because we wanted to save it for the show.
Yeah, right.
About why Notre Dame should be considered a title contender. And there's a couple reasons why we're having this conversation now. Number one is I'm still kind of floored by some of the preseason prognostications for Notre Dame. Not the ones that have them like, 8 to 10 to 12. I mean, I get those. Notre Dame still has some things to prove as a program. And I don't expect anyone. I would be a little surprised if any national outlet did pick Notre Dame to win a national title this year.
Sure.
I'd be like, okay, hold on. Maybe you're throwing a little bit, but that's part of it. I think there's a sentiment from a good number of Notre Dame fans that have made comments. And again, this isn't a criticism of them because I understand where their hearts are at and where they're coming from, which is geared towards some of the decisions that should be made personnel-wise should be geared towards the 2022 season and kind of using 2021 as sort of a getting ready for next season. I'm sympathetic to that too. You know me, I'm always about development.
Sure.
But I actually believe this season could be just as good of a chance for Notre Dame to compete for a title as next season, even though next season I think there's a chance that Notre Dame could have a better football team, overall football team.
Sure.
So that's what we're going to get into today. And really, Vince, what it boils down to, as you know, winning a title isn't just about what kind of team you have.
Correct.
But there's also some context that's needed, which is what do the other top teams have coming back. Well, and those two things are what really factor into this decision.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of factors, right? So number one, how good is your team going to be? Because obviously you need to be a decent team. Number two for me is the schedule. What does your schedule look like? I mean, is it a workable, doable schedule with a few highlights? Because you're going to have those for people to take you seriously. And based on things that we've seen from people, Notre Dame's got four of the top 10 games supposedly that are going to affect the national title conversation. Well, that's 4 of your 12 games. That's a third of your games are considered important enough that it's going to have something to do with the national title question. Well, if Notre Dame's involved in 4 of those, they have 4 opportunities to make a statement, right? So your schedule is very important. And then finally, and you hinted to this, it's what are the other normal national power teams? What does their team look like? Because what is Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson? What are those teams bringing back? Are they having to replace some key starters here and there? What does the depth chart look like? I mean, there's a lot of that as well because you said it perfectly before we started, Brian. You could have the best team you've had in a really long time. But if Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State also have the best team that they've had in a long time, that's really, really tough, right. But if everybody's kind of not necessarily rebuilding, but reloading, kind of figuring out maybe what their season identity is, things of that nature, then you got a puncher's chance. Mm-hmm. And I think if all of those stars align, then you've got a shot. And I think, and we're going to get into this obviously a little bit more specifically, but I think for Notre Dame this year, there's a chance that the stars align pretty well. So it's 6 months ago, I probably would have said you were nuts, thinking about this and this line of thinking. But the more we talk about this team, the more we look at other teams, the more I look at the schedule, the more I think this is a possibility.
Yeah, and before we begin, obviously this is going to be podcast form. So if you're watching live, if you're watching the show live, we're just going to continue to go through our points. We'll answer questions at the end.
Yes.
If you have a question or a comment that you want to get in during the show, you know what to do. Just hit the super chat, and we'll get it in there. So that's where we're going to go. But so Vince, here's to that point. I've said this before. 2015 was Notre Dame's best roster, like no question. I don't think that necessarily was the year that was Notre Dame's best actual chance to win a title. And what I mean by that is taking out none of the, well, if so-and-so was coaching on that team, right? Like, so
Sure.
we've said before, if the 2017 coaching staff was coaching the 2015 team, I think that team would have won a title, or at least played for a title. But that wasn't reality. That's just kind of hyperbole.
Sure.
When I look at the actual teams, I still say the best team that had a chance to compete for a title for Notre Dame was that 2017 team because, A, they had a really good team. They faded down the stretch. That was on them. They had a really good team, but the other part of it was that was a down year for Alabama. It was a down year for Clemson. That was the Kelly Bryant year for Clemson, a quarterback. They scored 6 points in their semifinal loss to Alabama. Alabama team was a really well coached. That was probably Nick Saban's best coaching job in 2017 because they did not have a vintage Alabama roster from a talent standpoint. And look, Georgia was the national runners up, and we saw that Notre Dame did with them in game 2 of the Chip Long, Mike Elko, Matt Bayless tenure.
Right.
So you just look at say that was actually their best shot. And that to me is kind of what I look at when I look at this 2021 football team is not only do I think Notre Dame is going to be better than people think, and we'll get to sort of Notre Dame at the end. We'll get into the reasons why I think this Notre Dame team should be better and then some of the concerns that we have that could keep this Notre Dame team from reaching its full potential. But there's some other factors is what those other teams, to your point, Vince, have coming back. And that's really why I look at this and say, we shouldn't be just ready to dismiss this season and be building for next year. I think there's always needs to be part of your program needs to be about development, but like we talked about the Kane Madden decision, right? And my concern with Caden Madden was I think this is going to hurt you next year because he's not, to me, an impact player. Having said that, if the Notre Dame coaching staff is correct in their analysis of Caden Madden, this makes a ton of sense. Because they have to do ultimately what's best for the 2021 football team.
No question.
Assuming as a guy is a needle mover. I like the depth and talent of the secondary position. I think in 2022, the secondary could really take a big jump forward, even if with the loss of Kyle Hamilton, because of that talent. But for 2021, getting a Caleb Evans would be the best thing. If we're looking at 2022, playing Drew Pine and or Tyler Buckner would be the best thing for Notre Dame. But the reason that you play Jack Cohn is because I think Jack Cohn gives you the best chance in 2021. So that's the thing is this team needs to be focused on that. And here's the reasons why. And I'll say this. If Notre Dame was a legitimate non-contender for the title, I'd be sympathetic to say, hey, maybe we should be thinking about Notre Dame
22.
Maybe doing some of those things, right?
And to be honest with you, going into the offseason this year, putting both of those schedules in front of me, looking at 21, looking at 22, looking at, what Notre Dame was losing and looking at where they were heading and all of that, there was part of me that was like, you know what? We need to plan for 22. Like that, the coaching staff needs to plan for 2022 because the schedule this year is going to be a little bit easier. It's an opportunity to get Tyler Buckner some reps. It's a time to get those young corners out. Like I was all in on 2022 and 2021 being, hey, you can go out and have a 9-10 win season. That's a successful season. You're kind of rebuilding a little bit, but you're building towards 22. But the more we talk about it and the more I look at it and some of the decisions that the coaching staff has made and some of the progress that some of these players have made, through the spring, I think you gotta circle the wagons on 21 before you start worrying about 22. And I have no problem with that whatsoever. And I think the coaching staff feels that way too. Otherwise, they wouldn't be looking for a grad transfer guard. You know what I mean?
I think if the coaching staff was thinking this was a year where they just don't have a chance to compete, if they think that and they brought in Caden Madden, that's dereliction of duty.
Yes.
If they thought that 2022, like 2021, look, we're just hoping we can be good again, then it would have been silly to bring in Jack Cohn. Silly.
Yeah, agreed.
I don't think they think that. And that's why I don't think those things are poor decisions. Now, again, we have our disagreements with Caden Madden and
of course
how good he is. But again, for the purpose of this conversation, we're going to assume that the Notre Dame coaching staff is correct in their assessment of Caden Madden. Okay?
Fair enough.
So then I look at it and I say, well, okay, look at Alabama, obviously. I don't think this Notre Dame team could beat the Alabama team from last year. I don't. I think last year's Alabama team was just really excellent in so many ways. Then I look at Alabama coming back in 2021, and I say, okay, they lose their quarterback. Well, they lost their quarterback the year before. Okay, fine. There's a difference, though. I think Bryce Young, who's going to be their starting quarterback, is an incredibly talented player. He's a redshirt freshman, former 5-star kid, played at Mater Dei, super, super talented kid. But he's a redshirt freshman with, I think, 22 career pass attempts.
Yeah, and all in mop-up duty. None that were of any kind of significance.
Right. 8 of them were in the season opener against Missouri.
Yeah.
You're looking at a kid who now steps into an offense that they have to replace. Not only do they have to replace 8 starters, 5 of those starters were first-round picks, and another one was a second-round pick.
Yeah.
You say, okay, they lost 2 great receivers on the 2019 team. They lost Jerry Jeudy and Henry Ruggs, although I would disagree that Henry Ruggs was a great player. He was a great athlete. There's a difference.
Sure.
Jerry Jeudy was a great player. And they still had Devontae Smith, and they still had Jalen Waddle and all those guys. Well, I don't think they have Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle on the 2021 football team.
Right.
And the guys they have that can be that are freshmen.
Mm-hmm.
You lose Najee Harris. Say, well, you got some really good young running backs, and that's true. Jason McClellan's a sophomore who's very talented. Trey Sanders is talented. They have Kamar Wheaton coming in as a true freshman. But I don't see that group being as good as what Najee Harris was last year. In time, potentially, but I don't think they're also the all-around players. The other thing that people are forgetting about this 2021 Alabama team, with all due respect, they have a big drop-off in coaching, in my opinion. Losing Curt Flood as the offensive line coach is a big loss. There's no question about it. So that's going to be a big thing for me, Vince, is I need to see them. I need to see them be able to coach as well. I think that when you look at Bill O'Brien, I look at him and I say, is that a guy really that is on the same level as Steve Sarkisian? No, he's not. I'm sorry. I mean, I don't care what anybody says. He's just not. He's not on that level. That's just where we're at, Vince. I mean, he's not Steve Sarkisian. He's one of the most overrated offensive coaches in football. I think his only time where he's ever earned that great offensive mind was when he was in New England. And you know my stance on that. I think that's, when you're playing for one of the greatest coaches ever, and you have one of the greatest quarterbacks ever, it certainly helps. I think he was an average offensive mind at Penn State. I think he was below average at Houston, wasted a lot of talent. And does anyone really think that he's like completely invested in this?
Yeah, exactly.
This
is like a pit stop, or trying to get back to where he wants to be. I can't imagine this is where he wants to be.
Right.
That's the best way I can put it.
And then you lose Curt Flood as your offensive line coach.
Right.
He goes to Texas with Steve Sarkisian, and you're replacing him with Doug Marrone. Now, I think Doug Marrone's a very good offensive line coach. This is going to be his first year, and Doug Marrone is another guy that has shown he wants to be. This is a guy that was the head football coach of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's the head football coach of the Buffalo Bills. I don't think his goal is to be the long-term offensive line coach for the University of Alabama.
Right, exactly.
And so you have all these new players and you have new coaches. To me, it's a recipe for a step back. Now, again, step back for Alabama means,
right.
They're still a playoff
it's all relative.
Contending team.
It's all relative. Yeah,
they're not going to go 4-8 like Notre Dame after 2015, but are they beatable? They're beatable.
Right.
That's the point. And then I look at Clemson and the focus is, Clemson should have a great defense this year, and I think that they will. But the reality is, I don't think a lot of people maybe it's not that they understand, because that makes it seem like I'm definitely right and they're wrong.
Yeah.
My disagreement with a lot of national analysts is I don't think this Clemson – I don't think people truly get how much they depended on Trevor Lawrence the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And we've seen that when they've gotten on the big stage.
Sure.
We saw that against Alabama or against Ohio State this year. We even saw it against Ohio State last year. We saw it against LSU last year, where if Trevor Lawrence doesn't have some, Superman performance against Ohio State in 2019, where he rushes for over 100 yards and overcomes his receivers dropping balls and all that, they get knocked out in the semifinals. He was a one-man show in the title game, and he was just the offensive line's not that good. T. Higgins, didn't play great in that game. Justin Ross didn't play great in those games. Then you come out this year, and it's the same thing. It's the overall talent is taking a step back, in my opinion.
Sure.
There's no Travis Etienne ready to just step into the lineup.
Right.
There's
Right.
not. Where at least at Alabama, you could say, yeah, but they've got Trey Sanders and Jason McClellan, and I don't see that. With all due respect to Lynn J. Dixon, who's a good football player, with all due respect to Will Shipley, who I think is a very good incoming freshman, there's a big drop off at running back between what they had and what they're going to have now. And look, who was the dude that did all the damage to Notre Dame last year? Right? It was Amari Rodgers. Sure. I mean, that's the guy who balled out on Notre Dame both times that they played.
Well, what does the offensive line look like for Clemson coming? Is it they all coming back this year?
They bring back 4 guys, but they lost their best offensive lineman.
Because their offensive line was
not good. And
not good.
The thing about it too, Vince, is when you look at here's last year Amari Rodgers had 3 100-yard games. 2 of them were against Notre Dame. So I mean, he's gone.
Sure.
He was a big-time player for them last year. Cornell Powell is gone. He's another guy that made a lot of plays for them. And when I look at the rest of their receiving core, E.J. Williams is a good player. Frank Ladson was a 5-star player. He hasn't played like a 5-star up to this point in time. Joseph Nagata's had a hard time staying healthy. I do like Bo Collins, who's coming in for them this year. I don't see the overall talent on offense that people think that they have. And here's the other part about it. The quarterback, I'm going to let you say his name, Vince.
Uiagalelei.
Yes, he is a great talent, but with that offensive line not being good, the way that they run that system, they need a quarterback that can be mobile. Yeah. You look at their 2 national title winning teams, they had mobile quarterbacks. Obviously, Deshaun Watson was more of a runner than Trevor Lawrence was when they won the title. But the last 2 years, Trevor Lawrence's legs have been a huge part. That was a huge part of the game in the rematch against Notre Dame.
Yes.
Notre Dame shut that running game down in the opener because there was no threat to run from the quarterback.
Right.
And DJ's not a runner. He's a pocket passer. And when you combine that with inexperience at running back and just not elite talent at running back, it all adds up. And so then you look at it and you say, boy, that's a beatable Clemson team. Again, Ohio State, they don't have a lot of losses on offense, but the losses they have are pretty important.
Significant.
They lost both guards. Trey Sermon is a big loss. Master Teague's a good football player. Master Teague averaged 4.9 yards per carry last year. Trey Sermon was over 7. Trey Sermon was a beast in the postseason. I mean, he carried them to victory in the Big Ten title game. He carried them to he was unstoppable in the postseason for Ohio State last year. Now, they do have a tremendous freshman coming in Travion Henderson, who's a great, great player. But Trey Sermon was a seasoned dude. He'd played in multiple playoff games because he played in the playoffs at Oklahoma as well. And then you talk about Justin Fields. And it's not just that they lose Justin Fields, but who's replacing him? It's either going to be a redshirt freshman or a freshman. Those are the 2 best options, right? So either be Kyle McCord or C.J. Stroud. Those are the 2 most likely options. One's a redshirt freshman with 0 career pass attempts, and the other one is a true freshman who obviously has 0 career pass attempts. So people are saying, well, Notre Dame's going to take a step back because they lost Ian Book. He's being replaced by a guy that has already led a team to a Big Ten title game in a Rose Bowl.
The Rose Bowl.
Right? And 10 wins.
Right.
Ohio State's losing a guy who I think we would all agree was a significantly better talent than Ian Book. I would hope that most people can agree with that.
No matter what anybody says.
If you're being honest and objective, you have to admit that Justin Fields in every way possible was a better quarterback than Ian Book. And he's being replaced by guys that have never thrown a college pass. And yet there's no expectation of a drop-off from Ohio State. Right? The other part of this is interesting too, Vince, is defensively. They're losing 7 starters from a defense that gave up 25 points a game last year. They gave up 25-plus points a game in 2018. They had a great defense in 2019. There's something different about that 2019 team compared to the other 2 teams. Do you know what it is, Vince? It's a trick question. Jeff Hafley was their defensive coordinator in 2019. He wasn't there in 2018, and he wasn't there in 2020. And the 2 years surrounding him, they gave up 13 points a game when he was the defensive coordinator in 2019. They gave up 25-plus in the year before and after him. I don't think that's coincidence. And they're losing 7 starters from that group.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Now, does Ohio State have a lot of talent coming back? Yes. Is Ohio State a contender for a national championship? Yes. Are they beatable? Absolutely.
Well, they're always a contender because they're in the Big Ten, and I'm not overly impressed with what's in the Big Ten. I mean, is that fair?
I think the Big Ten's ascending a little bit, and we get into that later in the summer. But no, there's still here's Ohio State, and then here's everybody.
Yeah,
I mean, I'll argue this: the talent gap between the best team in the Big Ten is equal to, in my opinion, the talent gap between Clemson and the next best team in the ACC.
Okay,
people won't agree with that because Penn State continues to get overhyped, Michigan continues to get overhyped, a lot of the teams continue to get overhyped, but North Carolina. Teams like that, I think, can give Clemson just as much of a run as
North Carolina's a
Big Ten
top 10 team, apparently.
Yeah.
So there you go. Man.
Apparently, I like that. I dig that. So to me, you have an already shaky defense that gave up 25 plus points per game, and you lost 7 of those starters.
Yeah,
that to me is
significant.
That's a big drop off.
Yeah,
and those are the traditional. Vince, the traditional sort of title contenders,
sure,
right? Those are the teams that everybody's like, well, that's the big 3, and
sure.
Rightfully so. And you talk about that defense, they lost Pete Werner, who was a 2nd-round pick from the defense. They lost Baron Browning, who was a 3rd-round pick. Tommy Togai, who was a 4th-round pick. Sean Wade, who was a 5th-round pick. Jonathan Cooper was a 7th-round pick. I mean, they lost NFL dudes.
Right
now for Notre Dame, that's a recipe for 7-5, but apparently for Ohio State.
According to everybody else.
That's
what you're saying.
You know who I'm talking about.
There's no sarcasm there whatsoever.
Right. the good old FPI. But for Ohio State, that doesn't mean anything.
Right.
They can lose their best running back. They can lose their two of their 3 best offensive linemen. They can lose a borderline top 10 pick at quarterback. They can lose 7 starters from a bad defense and a bunch of dudes that went to the NFL, and they're not going to miss a beat.
It's no big deal.
So they're another one. So then you get into what some of these other teams. I think Georgia might have the best roster coming back on paper just because of recruiting perception and all those type of things. My question there is Kirby Smart going to allow them to open up the offense? Is he going to allow Todd Monken to open up the offense? That's a question I have. If he does, they should have a very talented team coming back. Defensively, they have a lot of talent coming back. They've got some question marks in the secondary, but they have a lot of talent coming back. And they play a schedule that's going to be challenging. They start the season off with Clemson. They play Florida on a neutral field, so there's going to be a challenge there. The other team that a lot of people point to, and we've already seen some people in our chat talk about that, and that's Oklahoma.
Oklahoma, yeah.
And Oklahoma brings back a lot from last year's team. And Oklahoma was a sneaky good team at the end of the year. And the reason I say sneaky is because they had removed themselves from playoff contention by the 3rd game of the year.
Correct. Well, they were breaking a new quarterback. I think Spencer Rattler was not great at the beginning of the year. And I think he got better as the year went on. Yeah. And I think he kind of found his footing in that offense.
They were 1-2 after 3 games. Yeah. They were done at that point.
They were done. They were done. And so nobody was really paying attention anymore either after that. And when Oklahoma is quote unquote out of it, this day and age, right now, nobody really pays attention to the Big 12. I mean, it's just there's not because Texas hasn't forced anybody to watch their games in the past few years. So, when both of those teams are down, the Big 12 is the Pac-12. Like there's nothing really, you know what I mean? So,
and they have that same negative, that same negative vibe around them that Notre Dame has, not to the degree that Oklahoma has gotten in the postseason several times and. They've only once have they actually been in a game that was competitive. The game in 2018, they lost by 11 because Kyler Murray's phenomenal, but it was never a game where you actually thought that they were going to win the game. Right. And then, of course, LSU just absolutely embarrassed them in one of the most destructive, and this goes all the way back to the end of, the end of the glory days, of the Bob Stoops era. And the glory days is obviously, I think 2000, you had that title team in 2000, right? And then you had some really good teams, but then, when they got just destroyed by USC, that was kind of like, okay, Oklahoma's not serious at this point in time. The big game Bob stuff was kind of gone at that point in time. So I think they've got a little bit of that stigma, but they, when I look at Clemson or Oklahoma events, the thing about it is I have 2 questions about them. Number one is their quarterback as good as people say? I have my thoughts on that, and I think he's good, but I don't know if he's quite that good. Number 2, is their defense for real? I think that's a legitimate question. They did a great job against Florida in the postseason, and that's the game that kind of put them on the map for 2021.
Sure.
But Florida was missing a bunch of dudes that weren't playing in that game, and as we've seen with a lot of the SEC teams, they lay duds in the bowl games because they don't want to be there.
Well, they don't want to be there. Yeah, they're too good for the games that they end up
But
going
Oklahoma
to,
flat out whooped them. I don't care what your excuses are. Oklahoma whooped them. But my question is the defense really that much better? And then number 3 is their schedule is to the point where they may not even be able to get to that no matter how good they are.
Yeah.
They have, to me, a really tough schedule this year.
Okay.
I mean, you look at it at Oklahoma State, at Kansas State. I think Kansas State's beaten them each of the last 2 years. At Baylor, it's going to be year 2 of the Dave Aranda era. They played Texas on a neutral field. There's some potential, stub your toe games.
What? I mean, do you have the schedule in front of you?
I got the full schedule.
What does their non-conference look like?
They play. It's not great.
Okay.
They play at Tulane.
Okay, the Green Wave.
Yep. So that's Chip Long's introduction to the Green Wave is having to play a home game against Oklahoma.
Is that where Chip's at?
Yeah, he's OC. Him and Chris Water both at Tulane now.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yep. Western Carolina.
Okay.
Then home game against Nebraska. Well, that's going to go well.
Yeah.
Home game against West Virginia. And they're actually going to have a decent team this year, but it's at home. At Kansas State. Neutral field against Texas. That's the Red River rivalry, which by the way, I missed the old name. TCU. At Kansas. That's going to be bad. Texas Tech at home. At Baylor. Home against Iowa State, and then Oklahoma State. And then, of course, whoever the second best team in the Big 12 is, whether it's Iowa State or Texas, they got to play again.
Sure.
And so if they beat Iowa State on November 20th, there's a chance that 2 weeks later, they got to play Iowa State again on a neutral field. And as we saw last year when Iowa State beat Oklahoma in the regular season and then lost them in the postseason, it can be tough. The same thing happened to Texas a couple years ago. They beat Oklahoma in the regular season. This was 2018, the year that Oklahoma went to the playoff. Texas beat them in the regular season. They got a rematch in the title game, and Oklahoma handled business.
Sure.
So if they are able to beat Iowa State in that game, then they've got to get. Tommy's trying to get us demonetized, but down there. But
I see that.
But so again, Oklahoma probably has in my opinion, one of the more challenging schedules because I think the Big 12 actually is a better conference often than given credit for. I think Kansas State last year collapsed after they lost their quarterback. I think Kansas State's going to be a good football team. I think Texas made some really good hires, and look, Texas scored 42 points per game last year, and now they get Steve Sarkisian as their offensive coordinator, Kurt Flood coaching their offensive line. So I think they made some really good hires. They're going to be a challenging team. And look, Oklahoma only beat them by 8 last year. And that was a competitive game. And I don't think Texas should have won that game. Texas gave them that game. I mean, Texas was a poorly coached football team. So I think this is a league that is a little bit more challenging than people often give it credit for. There's no great teams in the Big 12, but there's 7 or 8 pretty quality teams in the Big 12. And that's the difference. And that's when if you bring your B game a couple times, you can get you can stub your toe. So I would say on paper, Oklahoma and Georgia are probably the 2 best returning teams on paper, but those 2 teams also have a whole lot to prove. So that's kind of so I look at it, Vince, and say, who's the juggernaut? Who's the proven juggernaut? Right. The teams that are quote unquote, the top teams on paper this year are 2 teams that have not proven they can win titles, in my opinion. And then there's a lot of assumptions being made about those other 3 teams that have competed for and won titles.
Right.
And where I just say I don't know if, again, are they going to be really good? Yes. Do I predict all of them to win their league? I'm still going back and forth on the SEC one. And but I mean, are they beatable by Notre Dame? That's the question.
Sure.
And now there's some things Notre Dame's got to do, but that's the question, Vince, at this point in time.
Well, and obviously you laid it out all beautifully as to what's out there across the country, and you didn't say anything about Pac-12 teams. I mean, supposedly Oregon's really good.
Well, I mean, and Oregon's but my point is I think Oregon's a contender, but no one views Oregon as a team Notre Dame can't beat if Notre Dame's good. I'm more looking at the teams that people have a perception that Notre Dame can't win. If Notre Dame gets matched up against Oregon in the postseason, no one's going to be like, oh, wow. Oregon, they got no chance.
Yeah,
it'd be like, you know what? There's 2 teams, a lot to prove.
Yeah,
and that's why I didn't put them in there.
And I think what you laid out is there's going to be a lot of good teams out there, but I don't know that there's a lot of
really good teams.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like that's the issue. In the past few years, we've looked at a few of those teams like, well, good luck. LSU a couple years ago, good luck. You're not going to beat those guys.
Notre Dame hasn't had a team since the 90s that could have competed with that LSU team.
I mean, nobody could compete with them that
right.
year. They beat how many top 5 teams?
They beat like 7 top 10 teams, I believe, that year.
It's ridiculous. So, I mean, that was just a buzzsaw. And even if Notre Dame had a really good team that year, they probably weren't going to beat LSU. So
Clemson had a really good team that year, and they got smacked.
Yeah, I mean,
they got smacked
around by them, and it just is what it is. So the point being made here is that there's a lot of good teams because the teams are going to be good, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, they're going to be good. Clemson's going to be good. Alabama's going to be good, right? The chances of Clemson not winning the ACC pretty not very good.
I'm still
right?
predicting Clemson to win the ACC.
Ohio State's probably going to win the Big Ten.
Right.
Okay. I mean, Alabama's going to be right there in the SEC conversation.
Alabama's the one that has the tougher road.
They do.
Because A&M's going to be improved. Georgia's going to be good. I mean,
the competition's better in the
going to
SEC.
be better. Exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
This is what it is.
Exactly.
So, but even though you'll have those guys as conference champions, they're not what they used to be. They're not what they were last year even. And yes, Notre Dame has a lot of questions they still have to answer, but we feel very confident in some of those questions going in.
Right.
And we're going to have to see what happens. We might be singing a different tune 3 or 4 games in. I mean, injuries, maybe they go back to the 4 tight ends and a cloud of dust, then that's probably going to spell some doom. But at the same time, the way things are going, we're all feeling good about the chances. Again, the stars are kind of aligning with those 3 categories that I brought up at the beginning, right? Mm-hmm. Notre Dame's schedule, Notre Dame's team, and the layout of the rest of the country.
Right. And I'd probably be having a different conversation right now had Jack Cohn not transferred in. And I think part of the reason why some Notre Dame fans don't, and we had this experience today on Twitter, part of the reason I think some Notre Dame fans don't view this as a year that Notre Dame should be competitive is because I don't think there's a segment of the Notre Dame population who only has ever seen Jack Cohn play like stats wise. Mm-hmm. And then they look at the blue gold game. I had someone tell me today that he was decent at best in the blue gold game. Number one, you should never form an opinion. I mean, if blue gold games mattered, Nate Montana would have been starter and Montgomery Van Gorder would have beat out Deshaun Kaiser. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Number one. Number two, if you don't think he played well in the blue gold game, we're just watching quarterback in completely different. And I don't mean that disrespectfully, but we're not watching quarterback the same way. I mean, we're not in the same, we're talking, I'm speaking in Spanish and you're speaking in German, right? We're not even speaking the same language.
Right.
But I just think, but when your assumption is, well, he's not that good anyway, then you're going to take any mistake that he makes and be like, see, and any good plays he makes is like, well, okay, whatever. It doesn't matter.
Right. Because you're looking for it.
Right. I mean, and that's just human nature. So, I mean, I get that, but I think that's a reason why a lot of Notre Dame fans aren't as high on this team, but that's actually one of the reasons I think Notre Dame has a chance to be pretty good this year is because I think, and this is what we'll kind of transition into, what are the reasons Notre Dame specific? Because look, Vince, it could be a down year for all these teams, and I think it will be. Sure. And again, down for them.
Right.
Again, you'll understand that, right? Down for them. Right. Meaning they're not as good as the previous versions of themselves. They're still better than most teams in the country.
Right.
And so is Notre Dame good enough to then beat those not as good of versions of themselves? And I think that right there is where it starts is part of this is our confidence comes from my immediate confidence. And you've kind of grown this level of confidence is in Jack Cohn.
Yeah.
And the fact that I believe the arrival of Jack Cohn is going to give Notre Dame a significantly better pass offense. And that is a big, big part of this whole thing.
No, I agree, and I think that what we've seen is that not only will Notre Dame have a better pass offense, the manner in which they have that pass offense is that change in philosophy. It's spreading the ball around, it's getting the ball into the hands of some other guys, short passes, RPOs, things of that nature, which Notre Dame has the weapons to turn those into big plays, to turn those into scoring drives, quicker, quick scoring, all of that. I really do feel like that's the difference in this Notre Dame team and some of the past because they're going to have that good defense. I'm very confident that the defense is going to be good. They're going to hold their own. I think for the first time in a little while, they're going to have the offense to match that, and they're going to have an offense that's going to score. And they haven't really been able. I mean, I can't remember, in recent history where I felt really good about Notre Dame scoring. You know what I mean? All the ball's in their hands. They're definitely going down and scoring. You know what I mean? In a semi to big game, that confidence just wasn't there.
2015 was the only 2015, and then up until Miami. I went into that Miami game with that confidence in 2017, and then of course that confidence was decimated. But I think that 2015 team, we saw that with that offense because there were games that year where Notre Dame needed to score late to get in it, and they did it. You did it at Temple, they did it at Clemson. I mean, they went down and scored a touchdown. They just didn't get the 2-point conversion. Saw it against Stanford where the offense went down the field. Their problems were more defensive oriented.
Sure.
And the offense kept them in that Fiesta Bowl as long as they could, but they just, when you're giving up rushing yards the way that they were giving up rushing yards in that game, and you lost Jalen Smith, and Sheldon Day was just shell of himself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was 28-21 at one point in time in the third quarter because of, the offense making some big plays in the pass game. But that's it. I mean, that's 11 years under Brian Kelly, and that's it. It's 1 year and then part of another.
Right.
And so maybe our confidence in the offense is misplaced, but you and I both have that confidence. And again, for me, it boils down to, if you break down the film on Jack Cohn, this is what you're going to see. Better arm than people think he has.
Yep.
And the Notre Dame coaches have said this, and I've heard this on and off the record, that they liked Jack Cohn, but they're surprised at his arm talent. Brian Kelly said this publicly. Tommy Rees has said this publicly. This is something I've heard from several sources off the record, which is, this guy throws the ball a lot better than I thought he was going to throw the ball, because all they had was the Wisconsin film, and that's what a lot of people's basing
he wasn't asked to do a bunch
but
of
I
stuff
did see some of those. I did like some of the stuff. So I've been talking about this, but his anticipation is excellent. His ability to process reads is excellent. His willingness to take chances is way better than what we've seen at Notre Dame in recent years. He'll attack the middle. He'll attack down the field.
He'll take those chances.
And I have a breakdown today at irishbreakdown.com where I begin my position player previews heading into the season, and I have a couple clips of Jack Cohn. One is on the road against Minnesota, who at the time was number 8 and finished the year 10th in 2019. Wisconsin went on the road to beat number 8 Minnesota, who finished 10th, right? So legitimate top 10, not 8th, and then you fall out. This is late in the year. They were 8th. They had finished 10th. And it's a 10-3 game, 10-7 game. And he just bangs a deep ball right over the middle, right over the top of the Minnesota defense for a long touchdown. He goes like 15-22 for 280 yards in that game with a couple scores. Then there's a big pass he has against Ohio State in the Big Ten title game where he's getting pressured and he just bangs a back shoulder to a guy. Real gutsy throw that we haven't seen a lot of Notre Dame quarterbacks make in recent years.
Yeah, no, I think the throws that he's going to be asked to make are not going to be difficult throws for the most part. And I think that he's got the guts to make throws that previous quarterbacks or previous philosophies, or however you want to say it, I don't want to get anybody mad at me, that just weren't being made. For whatever reason, those throws weren't being made, whether they were open or not, whether they were being called or not, they weren't being made. And I think Jack Cohn, has the stones to make those throws. And look, is he going to get in trouble now and again for making some of those throws? Yeah, probably.
You have to learn to live with that.
You have to. I mean, if you're going to throw deep, or if you're going to try to get into a tight window, you're going to get picked off. I mean, it's just going to happen. But is he going to be successful more often than he's not? Yes. And so I'm okay with making those decisions. And you and I have talked about this all last year when we were doing pods after games and talking about, the lack of wanting to go downfield and things like that. And we talked about the fact, look, even if you throw it incomplete, that's okay, because you're showing that you're willing to do it, And so there's going to be some that aren't going to connect. There's going to be some that get intercepted, but there's going to be some that are going to go. And what's the saying? You miss 100% of the shots that you don't take.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Like, you got to take some of those shots. And I think with Jack Cohn, you're going to see that. And so I'm excited about that. I really am. And so, we'll see. That's what I anticipate. You know what I mean? But again, we have to see it. But that's what we saw all spring.
Right.
And even though we didn't get to see a lot of the practices, we did see it in the spring. And so that leads to some optimism for me that Jack Coan is going to be that guy. And again, look, he's going to go out there and win the Heisman Trophy. That's not what I'm anticipating. And look, that's not what he has to do to make this team successful.
Right.
He doesn't have to be that 5-star Heisman Trophy winning quarterback. With the philosophy and the offense that we believe that Notre Dame is putting forth, he just has to be a facilitator. He has to be a Mac Jones, right? And if they win and he piles up numbers, he could get a call to New York. I mean, it's possible.
Ian Book finished 7th with very mediocre numbers. Why? Because Notre Dame was good. Because Notre Dame was good.
Correct.
I mean, that's it.
He's still wearing the golden helmet, so he's going to get that respect, whether he deserves it or not. Right?
And they're playing a much tougher schedule than they played last year, too.
Yes, absolutely.
I think another thing too is you and I agree. We won't get into it because we've recently done shows on it, but we believe there's a lot more skill talent on this roster than a lot of people have, and I think a lot of folks, including Notre Dame fans, are looking at what Notre Dame lost and focusing more on that than they are like with Ohio State and Clemson and Alabama. It's they lost these guys, but bam. And with all due respect, Notre Dame has proven in the last 4 years it can lose guys and replace them. They've done it every year. If they can replace Quentin Nelson and Mike McGlinchey and be better the next year, there's nobody on this football team they lost that can't be replaced. I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
It's just not the case. And so we've seen that happen before. And I think that when you look at the talent at receiver, that can be debated, right? But you can't debate the running back talent. You can't debate the tight end talent. I mean – So again, there's going to be plenty of weapons to work with. Defensively, they've definitely proven they can reload year after year after year with different coordinators. Mike Elko had a great year. Clark Lee did some very good things, and I think Marcus Freeman is going to continue to do the same thing. So, when I look at this offense and I look at this defense, I say, look, skill players really good, quarterback really good, front seven could be special. Your secondary is one of your question marks, which is one of the concerns I have, but your best player also happens to reside in the secondary.
And he can erase a lot of mistakes.
Right.
Guys.
Yeah, right. Sure. I think this is a very deep team that can sustain injuries. Because injuries will happen.
Yeah.
Alabama last year, for example, if Alabama didn't have, John Mechie ready to step in at receiver, that Jalen Waddle loss could have been a lot more damaging. Right. Yeah. And we've seen that you have to have depth. Notre Dame has depth. And I think the schedule has a unique combination of strength with also not being too strong to where it's impossible to go 11-1 or 12-0. Right. And we'll dive into the whole, do they have to be 12-0 thing? There's a really good question about it that we'll get into at the end of it. But I think the schedule sets up nicely, not just for Notre Dame, but also for the other teams, which is important. I mean, Alabama has to play. They start the season off against Miami. They play at Florida, they play at Texas A&M, at Mississippi State, at Auburn, and they'll have to either play Florida or Georgia in the SEC title game.
Yeah,
it's not a given. Alabama, and look, you say, well, Alabama wasn't in the playoff 2 years ago,
right?
Because they had 2 losses, right? So the SEC is catching up to Bama, right? That it is
absolutely, and I think Bama's going to take a step back,
right?
As well.
I don't think the personnel losses on offense from a coaching standpoint are being addressed enough.
Yeah,
and there's this assumption, well, Saban's going to make the right hires. He hasn't always. He just hasn't. You look at Ohio State; their schedule's pretty favorable. Clemson, pretty favorable, but again, that Georgia loss, depending on how that goes, that could end up being damaging to them if the schedule's not tough.
Well, and that's the thing. If the schedule's not tough, then people are going to look at that as their tough game of the season, and they're going to be like, look, great, they ran through the ACC.
Played one good team all year, and you got beat.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's going to carry a lot of weight, although you're going to hear plenty of people, well, that was at the beginning of the season, and look what they're doing now.
Of course.
Look what they're doing now. You know what I mean? And look what they're doing now against Duke. Like, I don't really
right.
There has to be some sane person in the room that says, look, they played one hard team and they lost, right?
For them, it's going to have to be North Carolina has to be as good as people think it is.
Yeah, they really are.
If they lose to Georgia, they're going to have to become the biggest Mac Brown North Carolina Tar Heel fans around.
That's fair.
Because that's who they're going to play in the ACC title game.
Yeah.
And you look at Georgia, if Georgia loses that game against Clemson, they also play they have at Auburn, Florida on a neutral field, Missouri at home. That's not going to be an easy game. At Tennessee should be a win. At Georgia Tech, those should be, competitive games. But if they lose to Clemson, they have a schedule that's somewhat favorable. Sure. Auburn on the road, brand new coaching staff. Florida in a neutral field. Florida, I think, has a chance to, I'm not sure what to think of Florida yet this year, Vince, because they did have some personnel losses, but they have a lot of talent coming back. I really like Dan Mullen. Yeah, but then if they can't afford to lose the SEC title game, that's the other thing.
Right.
Is, I mean, if they lose to Clemson, in my opinion, and then they win the division, the only chance that the SEC has of getting 2 teams in the playoff, which then factors into whether or not Notre Dame can get in the playoff,
sure,
is if an 11-1 Georgia team barely beats a 12-0 Alabama team or 12-0 Texas A&M or 12-0 LSU. That's the only chance they have. It's got to be a competitive game. But if the West beats Georgia and Georgia has a loss, then it's going to get really interesting. So those are the things I look at. So the schedule doesn't just work out well for Notre Dame. There's some competitiveness amongst those other teams that factors into it as well. So what are the concerns that we have about Notre Dame as far as what could keep Notre Dame from getting that level? Number one is we're wrong about Jack Cohn. Number two, my biggest question mark, Vince, is coaching. And that is Brian Kelly's ability to get the most out of this football team, which this year is going to be a little tougher because I don't necessarily trust the offensive line coach. And this is the opportunity for Jeff Quinn to completely shut up the doubters like myself.
Yeah.
And this, if he can get this off, again, do they have to play like they did last year? No, I'm not expecting that. That would be nothing but setting false expectations in an attempt to drive a narrative.
Sure.
That's all that would be. And I'm not doing that. They still have to be a top 10 group. Alabama doesn't fall off out of the top 10 when they have personnel. Look, Alabama lost 3 draft picks last year from their offensive line, a first rounder and a second rounder from that group. Right, they had 2 offensive linemen taken before Notre Dame's first offensive lineman in last year's draft. Is anyone expecting them to be average this year? They lost. No, they're not, because they've done this before. Oklahoma in 2018 lost Kyler Murray and 4 starting offensive linemen who all got picked within the first 4 rounds of the NFL draft. They still put up over 40 the next year and made the college football playoff. So why is Notre Dame being expected to have a big drop off? Yeah. Everyone tells me Jeff Quinn's a great recruiter. Okay.
Well,
everybody tells me he's a great coach. Okay, then we shouldn't be. Why are we worried about the offensive line then? Well, if you're someone who's told me that he's a great recruiter and a great coach, then why are we worried about the offensive line?
Yeah, and here's the thing, and we've talked about this. This is a big year for Coach Quinn. I mean, it's a huge year for Coach Quinn, and we're going to find out what he's made of, right? Because pretty much everybody on the roster is a Coach Quinn recruit. And has been coached by Coach Quinn the entire time that they've been there, right?
Unless I'm missing something. DNA is now completely gone, with the exception of Josh Lugg spending 1 season as a redshirt with him. That's it.
Okay, so this is a huge season for Jeff Quinn. I mean, and again, I think we did a podcast about this a few months ago, and my opinion hasn't changed, and I'm sure yours has not either. There's talent there. I do feel like it's being mismanaged to a degree, but that kind of falls on the shoulders of the offensive line coach. So we're really going to see who Jeff Quinn is during this season and in this offseason and into August, because, is going after the Madden kid, is that spearheaded by Jeff Quinn? You know what I mean? Like, did he go to Brian Kelly and be like, look, we have nothing at guard. Like, we need a guard.
I have no faith in the guys at guard.
Yeah, like I would love to know what that conversation was like. You know what I mean? And
then Brian Kelly made a comment today at his golf outing.
Okay.
That kind of hinted that maybe this is a move that talks about what you and I talked about the other day in our Kane Madden podcast, which is maybe this is a move that ultimately ends up with Jarrett Patterson back at center.
It's possible.
So now you're talking about that vaunted 2019 class would have 0 starters from it as juniors. So, that's problematic. Now, again, that's Brian Kelly just says things and you kind of just have to take it with a grain of salt, especially when he's about to go play golf.
Oh, for sure.
So I'm not putting too much into that, but that's just what he does. He just says these kind of things that you're like, what in the world? Yeah. So was Kane Madden brought in so that Jarrett Patterson could go back to center so Zeke Correll goes to the bench?
Yeah, I mean, like that at all. But that's a whole other conversation. I'm all in on Zeke Correll's stock. You know what I mean? I'm pushing my chips in on him. So I don't like that move at all.
But again, it's not a move. It's inferring from something that Brian Kelly said. For all we know, it means Zeke Crow is going to move to guard.
Sure.
I mean,
yeah, you're right.
But yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things where you say, boy, just when you think they got the answers, that he goes and says something that makes you question what the heck they're doing.
Yeah,
but the offensive line is a concern for me. And then the other one is especially if Notre Dame doesn't get a Caleb Evans at cornerback,
sure,
they're an injury away from at 3 positions from being in trouble in the secondary. Now there's depth there, but it's very unproven and inexperienced depth, and it's depth with bigger question marks. So if Kyle Hamilton or Houston Griffith goes down, if either Cam Hart, Clarence Lewis, or Tariq Bracy go down, then I'm concerned about the secondary. Yeah. And it won't hurt them as much during the regular season, except against 2 teams, USC and North Carolina, in back-to-back games. But it then becomes problematic if you're going to have to play Clemson or Oklahoma or Alabama or Ohio State in the postseason. That's when it becomes a bigger problem.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
So those are the things that kind of concern me, Vince.
Yeah, no, and with good reason. And I think a Caleb Evans is so crucial right now. I wish he would have pulled the trigger as quickly as the Madden kid from the Thundering Herd, because I would feel a lot better about the secondary. Now, look, this has nothing to do with the fact that I think there's a lot of talent there.
Yeah,
at corner.
Agree.
It's just young, unproven talent. And
right.
And, if those injuries that you just talked about occur, could somebody step up and be okay? Yeah, they could be. I mean, they could be.
I'm not as confident in the depth at corner as I am at receiver.
And that's fair. And I don't know that I want to put that kind of pressure on those young kids just yet. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. I'm not saying they're not ready. I'm not saying they're not well coached, because I think they are very well coached. I think Mike Mickens is an amazing coach. But do I want to put them in that position? Do I want that to be a possibility? No, I don't. So bringing in a Caleb Evans is really crucial to that position group. I really want him.
Otherwise,
badly.
the margin for errors is really
so slim.
Really
it is so slim. And I will say another position group that I'm semi worried about from a depth standpoint would be safety. And they're 1-2. Super excited about the 1-2. I really am. And we know that Marcus Freeman wants to go to a third safety, and that's great. I think they're going to be better off putting a corner in that spot.
I think he has no problem doing that. I mean, from doing having some conversations this offseason, I don't think they have any problem. It could be a linebacker. He's not as locked into that as we saw in past places.
And so that makes me feel better about the safety position, but that's you're one injury away at safety to being a little bit in trouble there too.
Yeah.
So
I'm actually more concerned about safety than I am corner.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I also feel like getting Caleb Evans helps you at safety too, because you can then move some guys around.
Sure. Yeah, for sure.
And you can move corners to help you at safety. You can't move safeties to help you at corner. I mean, in theory you can, but on the specific makeup of this team. So, and the other part of it too, Vince, is look, if we're wrong about Jeff Quinn and our analysis of Jeff Quinn is wrong, then that only adds to the potential for this football team.
Absolutely.
Because if Jeff Quinn is the coach that some people think that he is, and honestly, deep down, I hope that he is.
Yeah.
Then this will be Brian Kelly's best offense by far.
Yes.
Because again,
I don't have
quarterback. Best running back of Kelly's era, arguably.
Yep.
Deep group of receivers that fit the modern game. Arguably the best tight end coming back in the country. And if he is as good as people say he is, then there's going to be no issue on offense, and we know the defense is still going to be good again.
Yeah.
So then what's holding you back?
Yeah.
And so and honestly, and that's what I'm hoping for, which is part of where my excitement comes from. Like, look, if I thought there's no doubt about it, full throttle, Jeff Quinn can't get it done, they're not going to make the change on offense, we would not be having this show today. We would have picked something else to do. So I think that my hope is that I'm wrong about that, just like I hope I'm wrong about Kane Madden, because that, to me, more than anything, is the one holdup.
Yeah.
Keeps me from fully jumping on board on this being a year where Notre Dame has a legit national championship.
Sure.
That is it, because I don't see the weaknesses at other places relative to the teams they're competing against or have to compete against in 2021. They're still got the best roster of any team they're going to play.
Yes, agreed.
And to me, they have a roster capable of going to battle with anybody in the country based on what those teams are going to have in 2021.
Correct.
2022 might be a different story.
Right. And we're not talking about tradition, and we're not talking about past success. We're talking about what we see this year on each team and what it looks like when they will face off with each other.
Right.
On June 7th. Like, with the way things look right now, I think the stars are aligning to make a run. Now, again, a million things can go wrong. Injuries
with a lot of teams. But that's
with a lot
true
of
of
teams.
everybody.
That's absolutely correct. And so, Clemson beats Georgia, and that now, just there's a million things that can happen. What happens if
Bryce Young gets hurt at Alabama?
Yeah, good point.
What happens if JT Daniels goes down to Georgia? I mean, there's a lot of teams that are one dude away from being screwed more than Notre Dame is.
Correct.
In my opinion. Much more than Notre Dame is.
Yep. I agree. If Coden goes down, I still have confidence that Notre Dame can do what they need to do with either Pine or Buckner.
Correct.
Will you slim it down a little bit if there's a freshman?
That is not true at Alabama.
No, it's not.
That is not true at Georgia.
No.
That is not true at all. I mean, and look, actually, Oklahoma, I think it is true because I love Caleb Williams, the freshman quarterback they have.
Okay.
And I think there's enough talent around him, and Lincoln Riley's such a good quarterbacks coach that they'll still be good.
Okay.
But a lot of those other teams, they lose their quarterback.
It's game over. I mean,
they're in trouble.
It's a different season. It's a different season.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way.
They're in a lot of trouble. So that's where our optimism comes from. That's why when we look at it, when we look at the teams coming back, the fact that those teams are slowly coming here and Notre Dame is kind of here. I mean, look, Notre Dame was a 17-point. They lost to Alabama by 17 last year. It would have been worse had Alabama kept their foot on the gas. But let's say they lose by 24. Well, a lot of the people responsible for that game, the quarterback, the running back, the receivers, the defensive lineman, Patrick Surtain, all the guys that had the biggest roles in beating Notre Dame last year are all gone.
They're all gone.
I mean, and the guys that played the best for Notre Dame in that game are all coming back.
Right. And look, and we're not saying that the guys replacing those guys are scrubs. It's just they have not earned the right to be called great yet.
Right.
I mean, they just haven't. Right. And so this is an opportunity. That's what we're saying.
Right.
With the personnel.
Again, not saying these teams are going to be bad.
No.
They're still going to be very good, but it's a lot like 2017. Alabama won the title in 2017. You tell me you stack that 2017 Alabama team up against the 2020 Alabama team, and you tell me who wins. You stack that up against the 2019 Alabama team that lost 2 games. Right? But what happened to Alabama in 2019? Circumstance. LSU had a great year, and they lost their quarterback, which is why they lost the Auburn game. Right? So, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Even though they had Mac Jones ready to replace Tua as a senior, where he was a junior at the time, right? They still lost to Auburn because even though Mac had talent, you step into the starting lineup in a big game, you're going to make mistakes. Sure. And Mac threw for a bunch of yards that game, but he also threw 2 huge picks.
Yeah.
I think at least one of them got returned for a touchdown, right? So this is a future first-round pick. You're just not going to slide a quarterback in the starting lineup.
We talked about in the 3-hole
right
for a long
in a
time.
System where it's so quarterback-driven, and that is the final thing. Is Notre Dame's system. If they're going to do the things that we hope they're going to do, it's a much less quarterback-driven system.
Yeah,
that's it.
No question.
That's where it's at.
No question. The system that they've got now is to distribute the ball, get it in the playmakers' hands, and go and see what happens, And so if that's the case, I love it. But we'll see.
Yep.
So we jumping in here with both feet?
Let's get up some questions. So first of all, I want to get this one out here real quick. Okay, I want to start with this one because we So Dylan asks, also, Coach, I know you're a dog dad. Just got a puppy I fostered and plan to adopt. Any tips? Dylan, do me a favor. Shoot me a DM on Twitter at CoachD178. I definitely have some tips on this. Both of our dogs were failed fosters. So that's a good thing. That means we were going to foster them. A failed foster is actually a term that people use is when you foster a dog, because when you foster a dog, you're meant to give it back.
Yeah.
Well, we didn't want to give either one of our dogs
No
back.
dog comes
We
in
had to
with
remove ourselves from the foster program because we were going to end up with 37 dogs.
Right.
Because I was not giving those dogs back.
No dog enters the Driscoll household and leaves. That's really what
unless
it comes down
has
to.
an owner that is out of town and plans on bringing it back, and and even then, it's not easy. We thought about moving a couple times while people were out of town with their dog.
Right.
Not really. But so anyway, hit me up at Coach D170 on Twitter, and I'll definitely try to give you some advice on that one. And Dylan, I'm glad to have you back. We haven't seen you and the other Dylan in a while. So first time on live in a long time. Happy to be back and ask questions. I usually agree with all your takes, Coach. However, I love the Madden pickup. And if it pans out, it's great for Notre Dame this year. Agree completely. If Kane Madden is as good as you think he is, Dylan, and as good as Notre Dame thinks he is, that's a huge pickup. Because what did we say at the end? What's the one question mark that Vince and I have about this team?
Offensive line.
So we're wrong about Kane Madden. And trust me, from a businessman standpoint, from a business owner standpoint, first and foremost, I want to be wrong because it's good for me business-wise if Notre Dame's successful. And as someone who grew up a Notre Dame fan my entire life, I enjoy when Notre Dame's successful. So, buddy, we're with you. I hope you're right. And I hope your disagreement with me ends up being one of those times where you can say to me that you were right. I hope that's true. Because that honestly is the only thing holding me back right now from this football team being – really feeling like it can get there.
Got a super chat, Brian. Got to hit it.
Go ahead and read it.
Yeah. What can be done to address? Oh, first of all, thank you. Is it AST12321?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Put your glasses on today, man. You're like all up on the screen. Like, what is
I know, right? What can be done to address the teams trying to take Lindsey off his routes with jamming and redirecting, either scheme or wide receiver technique wise? Well, first of all, from a scheme standpoint, have him be the off receiver. I mean, don't have him up on the line. And that's the easy thing to do. You put him because he's going to be playing the field side. And let's say you put Michael Mayer in the slot, so to speak, right, as the second receiver. We'll put him up on the line and have Braden Lindsey back. And that automatically will prevent him from being jammed, right? Because then there's things that you can do from a technique standpoint to get away from that jam because you've got a couple of steps before you're going to make contact with the defensive back. So that would be the first thing I would do if he's really getting jammed up. But you better be a really, really good corner if you're going to try to jam up Braden Lindsey, because if he gets a step on you, which is a lot easier to do in man than it is in zone, you're in big trouble. So you better have a studly guy that wants to play man against Braden Lindsey, because you're taking your life into your own hands.
You only have to lose twice for it to be 14 points.
Correct.
That's the thing.
Yes.
I think there's a few things that can be done schematically, Vince. I think number one, your point is correct, not just in the 2x2, put Mayer to that side, but look, a lot of times if he's to the field and you're in the 2x2, you're not going to want Michael Mayer. You're not going to want to have Avery Davis in the slot, right? But if you're in a 3x1 with the tight end to that side, it's easy because you can always have Michael Mayer attached, whether or on the line, whether it's as an attached tight end or if he's split out, you can always put him as the number one.
Yep.
There are other things they can do, like motioning him, playing him in bunch routes. We saw this last year against Florida State. Yeah, they went on a bunch route. They ran him on a delayed cross, hit him, and he ran in for a touchdown. There's things he can do there. Yep. But at the end of the day, too, to his question, and I think this is a great question, by the way,
too.
Because
putting our 101 hats on.
I look at Alabama, right? If Braden Lindsey was healthy against Alabama this past year, he could have been a big impact. But I'm worried that he would have got beat up at the line of scrimmage by Patrick Surtain all game.
Sure.
Because he's not great at getting off the line. The problem is that's a team-wide issue. That's been an issue at Notre Dame for the last several years. Chase Claypool wasn't good at getting off the line. He could just muscle guys. Miles Boykin could just muscle guys.
Right.
But part of the issues that they both had against Clemson was Clemson had bigger corners that were good at pressing, and they couldn't just muscle those guys. And so I do, but that goes back to one of the issues I have with the offensive coaching, which is there's way too much emphasis on volume of scheme and less emphasis on technique. They don't teach route running effectively. They just don't. They don't teach press release so effectively because they have to look, as a coach, you only have so much practice time and so much meeting time.
No question.
And if you're putting in a high volume of plays and then I have to focus my time on install and those types of things and those adjustments, because if I got 20 different pass concepts that we're taking into a game, and I've got to teach those guys all the potential route variations based on what teams can do. I don't have a whole lot of time to practice on, stance and start and getting out off press and doing any kind of advanced moves and things along those lines. You just can't do it.
Right.
And so that's another thing too, is I think if they can sort of take some of the volume off of the offense from a scheme standpoint, doesn't mean you're going to run 5 plays. Right. There's a happy medium that you can see here from a lot of places. Then I think you can focus on more time because to the question, you can't protect him every single play. You can't.
Right.
If you just,
but he's not going to be on the field
needs
every
to be able to win
anyway.
enough
But
there.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Sure.
And he needs to be able to do that. So part of this is also on Braden saying, hey, look, this is a part of my game I got to get better at, and I'm going to go get better at it. So I think Dylan had another question, correct? Dylan says that in the head coaching rank, actually, so he talked about the Kane Madden one, and then he followed up with that in the head coaching rankings where you had Riley over BK have been the only 3 times where I think I wanted to push back on your notion. Otherwise, I enjoy the takes you have, and Indy can win a title. Dylan, I'd be curious to hear what your justification would be for having Brian Kelly ahead of Lincoln Riley. I'm not saying – look, as I said on the time, I think a case can be made for Brian Kelly to be third. I'm just not making it because the fact is Lincoln Riley's had more success than Brian Kelly. Even though he's only been at Notre Dame or Oklahoma for 4 years, they've been pretty good. He's got more playoff appearances than Brian Kelly. So but again, I think a case can be made. I'm curious to hear you make it. So, yeah. There you go. And Tommy, if you put in just about any question, as long as it's any appropriate, any question you ask, we'll get into the.
It wasn't inappropriate. It was more political. So I didn't know if we wanted to go down that road.
We would not do that. No, this is a sports show. Okay.
Right.
If you want to talk politics, we can talk politics off the show, but this is a sports show.
So Tommy says another new background for Vince. Where are you at today? Summer school is where I'm at today, and summer school is all virtual. So I guess we're gonna double dip. On that one. So, summer school for me. So a different high school than I was at previously in a different classroom. So just trying to make that money, baby. Summer school.
They're like, Driscoll's not paying him enough.
All right. Oh, Dylan, my man, definitely plan on getting some gear from Irish Breakdown. So, Brian, you want to direct everybody to that site?
Yeah, right below.
Hit it.
The very first link here, it's store.irishbreakdown.com. But we have a link in the description below. You can find our gear there. But if you're listening and you're not maybe looking at the computer, it's easy. Store.irishbreakdown.com. It's not hard. Not hard at all. And if you can't find it, hit me up on Twitter. Look, I tell you all the time, there's a reason I keep my DMs open on Twitter. It's because I want people to be able to reach out and get engaged.
Absolutely.
I don't want people like, hey, follow me back so I can have a conversation with you. I'm not that big time.
Yeah, right. Connor jumping in. He says, assuming Notre Dame wins all their regular season game, who stands in Notre Dame's way other than the usual suspects? Is there a dark horse playoff foe? So
I think
other than
Oklahoma and Georgia. I think those are the two that I think on paper have chances to be really good this year.
Is there a chance of somebody coming out of the Pac-12?
To be a team, is there a chance that Oregon could make the playoff this year? Absolutely. I think Oregon has a really good football team. I think Mario Cristobal is a good football coach. I just look at it and say, I don't view Oregon as standing in Notre Dame's way unless Notre Dame doesn't play well or doesn't coach well, because I still think Notre Dame has a better roster than Oregon.
I do too.
So
I agree.
But I think the two teams that can match Notre Dame coaching and talent, I do think Oklahoma has a very talented team. Excuse me. And I think Lincoln Riley's an offensive genius. I really do. And Georgia would be the other one because Georgia's got a lot of talent. Georgia's got so much talent that they can overcome Kirby Smart's mediocre coaching. That's how good Georgia's talent is.
Matty K says Notre Dame proved that they can beat DJ Uiagalelei by taking away the run game and forcing DJ to throw himself. So we have that. I'm not sure how much that plays into the future meetings, though. I think it plays a lot into the future meetings because if you keep him in the pocket and you make him a pocket thrower, which is what he wants to be anyway, I like our chances with our defensive line and our linebackers and our defensive scheme against Clemson's offensive line, and I like that matchup personally. So I'm all for it. I think that does have a lot to do with it.
Vince, look, DJ is a very talented player, and this isn't necessarily even on him. I think it's more about the makeup of the team. Bless you. I think if Clemson had Notre Dame's 2020 line coming back this year, I wouldn't be having the same conversation.
Sure.
I'd have a completely different opinion of Clemson. But when you have a quarterback who's not overly mobile, you have to have a really good pass pro offensive line. And I don't think Clemson has that. And look, they've never had a great offensive line. This entire time under Dabo, they've never had a great offensive line. They've had some good offensive lines.
They've had great quarterback play.
But they've also had quarterbacks that were good at making plays with their legs. I mean, the year in 2015, Deshaun Watson rushed for over 1,000 yards.
Yeah.
You know, he's a guy that could some of the best plays he's ever made on plays when he got pressured. Trevor Lawrence is the same way.
Right.
Especially as he got deeper into his career. So he's a bad match for what they have up front unless the offensive line plays a lot better. And again, it won't hurt him most of the time. They'll still be able to dominate. But look,
absolutely,
he started 2 games last year, right? 1, they had to come back in the second half to beat Boston College. And 2, they lost to Notre Dame. They didn't exactly look like a great team. Now, he'll get better, right?
Sure.
He'll definitely get better.
Sure.
But he's not going to have Amari Rodgers and Travis Etienne and this year, Cornell Powell this year. And the guys that are coming back just haven't proven a lot to me. And again, I've always said, I don't care about experience. It's not that those guys don't have experience. I don't care about that. I don't think they have the talent that they've had at receiver that they've had in past years.
Kenny is very high on Spencer Rattler. He says he's got the best quarterback in the country. Thoughts?
I mean, he's going to be in the conversation. I'm not as high on Spencer Rattler as other people are. I'm just not. He still has a lot to prove to me. Physically, he's got a lot of tools. I don't think he's necessarily the runner that Kyler Murray was, but he's mobile. Okay. He's got a big arm. Dylan's already – I just got the email. Dylan's already got his gear, Vince. He's already got the gear purchased, so I love it. I just I think he's a really good player. I think the key for Oklahoma and Spencer Rattler too is the run game's got to get on track.
Yeah.
And that's a big question mark. So they kicked Seth McGowan off the team. They lost Ramondre Stevenson. TJ Pledger transferred, but Kennedy Brooks is coming back. Kennedy Brooks rushed for 1,000 yards in 2019. He didn't get hurt last year. He opted out because of COVID. So it's not like he's coming back from a knee injury. And then they also got Eric Gray to transfer from Tennessee. Now, if those two guys are step up to the plate, that to me is the missing link for Oklahoma. And that's what hurt them at the beginning of last year is there was even more pressure put on Spencer because they couldn't run the ball early in the season like they had in past years. And so if you look at early in the season, they ran for 124 yards in a win over Southwest Missouri State, averaged 3.5 yards of carry. Then in losses to Kansas State and Iowa State, they rushed for 130 yards and 114 and averaged below 4 yards per carry. They averaged below 4 yards per carry in their first 5 games and 2 of their last 3 games. They were only over 5 yards per carry in 3 games last year. That is abnormal for Oklahoma. Let me tell you this is what they did in 2019. 9.6, 8.0, 7.5, 6.7, 7.2, 7.3, 5.2, 3.9, 5.5, 4.4, 5.7, 6.4, and then they weren't good in the last 2 games of the year. So for them to only be above 3 yards per carry in 3 games is concerning. Now, everyone's going to say, well, look what they did to Florida in the bowl game. They were awesome.
Right.
But I always say you need to not put too much emphasis on bowl games.
Right.
Bowl games are different. You do them at the end of the year after weeks off and all this other kind of stuff.
Well, personnel, like with Florida specifically, their personnel was not what it was season.
I love bowl games. I think bowl games should matter, but I just feel like we put too much emphasis on bowl games. And we see it every year. This team's going to be really good because of what they did at the end of the bowl game this last year, blah, 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 blah. And and then it ends up not panning out. So the run game to me is more important than Spencer Rattler. But look, I think he's a really good quarterback. I think he's got a lot to prove before anyone's going to be. I think it's more about the hype of what they've had there before and the assumption he'll be a great player.
Sure.
Could he end up being that guy? Sure. But he's got a lot to prove to me, and his numbers are going to be great because the offense he plays in. But I want to see how he does when the game's on the line in some of those big games, because that's where he didn't show up well last year, in my opinion.
D-Rock has a comment. He says, if this Notre Dame team optimally uses their depth on both sides of the ball, implements an aggressive style on offense, defense swarms at the ball, and special team steps up, the Irish will rocket. That's all that has to happen. No big deal. But no, I agree. If all of those things happen, Notre Dame's going to have a very successful season. David says you can never sell Oklahoma State short. You don't know year to year what you will get out of them.
It's so true.
He's right about that.
So
man.
True.
Because there's times where they will lose to a terrible team, and then all of a sudden you're watching SportsCenter and they're knocking off a top 5 team.
Yeah.
Like it just,
or there's years where you look on paper, they're not going to be that good that year, and then all of a sudden, bam, they go out and play well. I mean, they're an odd team. But the only thing I'll say about them is they've kind of had 3 down years in a row.
Okay,
and that's usually when a coach has been there as long as he's been.
Sure.
That's usually a sign that some things are going on. But I would also say they had a couple malcontents on their team last year that are gone now too. And I'm curious if that might end up being a benefit to them. But what we just said backs up exactly what David said, which is you never know what you're going to get from Oklahoma State.
No doubt about that.
You just never know. And TCU's similar to that way too. TCU will be like 4-8 one year and then like playing in the Big 12 title game the next.
Yeah,
and that's that's also partly what makes the Big 12 a lot more competitive than they often get credit for. The reason the Big 12 gets dinged a lot is because Texas is down. There's not another name in the conference, and because Oklahoma wins it every year.
Yeah,
but it's a better conference, in my opinion, than people think. It's just I think Oklahoma's really good, but Oklahoma in a lot of times has had to beat a team that beat them in the Big 12 title game to win it. They did it last year with Iowa State. They did it 2 years ago or 2 years before that with Texas, where they had to beat a team that beat them to win the division. So it's not like they're just doing what Clemson did and going undefeated every year.
Right.
They're usually going into the playoff with a loss.
Yeah.
They've been knocked out a couple times because of losses. So, and I think that it's a competitive league. It's not a great league. It's just it's a deeper. There's not like 3 or 4 great teams and a bunch of garbage. There's a lot of solid football teams in that league.
I hear you. All right, let's see. We got a couple comments about, the conversation over to the side here has been, who is the competition for Notre Dame, et cetera, et cetera. So we got OU has had a great transfer portal result, much improved on both sides of the ball. So we got that comment. D-Rock says Georgia is thin in the secondary and talk is now as ex-Bama DB Turnage may leave Georgia.
He wasn't that good to begin with.
There you go. Thus, the Bulldogs' recent offer to Tulsa, Caleb Evans. So that is interesting.
Yeah. You missed one up there from Alejandro.
Oh, did I miss one?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yep. Sorry, you're right. What about Texas A&M? Love the show, by the way.
Texas A&M to me is an intriguing team.
They are.
I think that they are way overhyped based on last year's team. They got smacked by Alabama. And say, well, wow, they beat Florida. Florida was a 4-loss team last year.
They were.
Okay.
Florida gets a lot. I mean, I don't know. They
beat North Carolina in a bowl game. North Carolina didn't have their 2,000-yard running backs and their 1,000-yard receiver. And North Carolina was still in the game in the second half.
Right.
So that's – and Jimbo just, to me, has not been great in the big games. I mean, I had that stat that I showed up the other day that his last 4 years, including last year, he's had double the losses in the last 4 years against ranked teams as he's had wins. The fortunate thing for them last year is they played 3 ranked teams. That's it. They got killed by one. They barely beat another who was a 4-loss team. And then the other ranked team that they beat didn't have their 3 best players in the bowl game. 4 best players because Chaz Surratt didn't play in that bowl game either. So they got a lot to prove to me that they weren't just a one-year wonder that took advantage of the COVID year. Sure. That's the thing for me with Texas A&M. Now, they lost the guy that was many people consider to be the heart and soul of their offense in Kellen Mond. I think Kellen Mond was very overrated. But who's he going to be replaced by? I don't. There's not a lot. I mean, their backup quarterback last year threw 4 passes. There's a chance that a freshman or a redshirt freshman could start. That's a question mark for me. Their receivers are a little shaky, but I love their backfield. I wrote an article yesterday comparing Notre Dame's backfield to the best backfields in the country, and they've got a very good backfield coming back. The big key for them, though, is going to be Mike Elko.
Yeah.
He's got a lot of talent coming back, and he's now been there, what has it been, 18, 19? This is going to be his 4th year, right? So the whole defensive roster now is his recruits. So he's got to now take them to the next level defensively. If Texas A&M is going to be a legitimate contender this year, that's the side of ball that's gonna matter. But when I look at it compared to Notre Dame, I don't see how they score on Notre Dame unless Notre Dame's offense is not as good as we think. Just matchup wise, I don't think they match up great against Notre Dame. But that is a team that I kind of have my eye on to say, are they gonna? Was last year a fluke, or was that the beginning of something for Texas A&M? I don't know the answer to that. I have my doubts that it's beginning of something, but this year's going to tell us because Vince, I think Mike Elko is a heck of a defensive coordinator.
No doubt.
And he's going to have a lot of talent to work with this year.
Ronald says, I don't see who is more talented, has a superior coaching staff, or superior in any way to Notre Dame. We can talk about Alexander or the line coach, but who is superior? I don't see it.
Well, I think Ohio State in a lot of ways has a superior coaching staff. Not at every position. I mean, there's
You're
no
not going to find anybody
staff
that's more talented across the board in all of these different
right. But I mean,
that I agree with.
Alabama's coaching staff, for the issues that I just talked about, it still has Nick Saban, right? And he's still the best coach in college football.
Right.
I think Clemson's coaching staff, even though they lost Jeff Scott recently, is still a really good coaching staff. They're better than Notre Dame in some spots. Outside of that, I mean, look, if it comes down to coaching against Georgia, Notre Dame's going to win. I mean, that hasn't been the issue. The issue has been play. Georgia's had better players than they had the last two times they played. That's just a fact. Not by a ton, but that's been the reality. They had more depth of impact players. I mean, Oklahoma, Alex Grinch, to me, that's a question mark for me. Is Alex, the job that Alex Grinch has done building the defense, is that going to sustain? Is that going to last? Or was it just sort of a down the stretch, success last year? I mean, but look, their offensive line coach and their head coach, from an offensive mind standpoint, I'll put up against anybody. So, I think Notre Dame is like a lot of teams, Ronald, is they have some areas where they're very strong from a coaching staff standpoint. There's some areas that are question marks. And I think that's true at Alabama. I think that's true at Georgia. I think that's true at Clemson and Ohio State. I think we could argue that there's some teams that you have to say have better coaching staffs because of their success. But that is a very subjective discussion for me, because I think a lot of times you just say, well, look at the records. And I don't think just looking at records is a great way to make arguments for how good of a coaching staff is, because one coach may be maximizing a program's potential and be going 8-4. Another coach goes 10-2 and he underachieved for what that program should be.
Absolutely.
Because not all programs are built equal.
Right.
And so that's what makes this a very subjective discussion.
I think this next question or comment, I guess, from Patrick, we could do a whole show on this.
Can I do something here real quick?
Yeah.
So Kenny Moore said Jimbo guaranteed they would beat Bama. Saban just giggled. He didn't just giggle. He said, at what? Golf? Which was the most savage response ever.
Did he really?
Now, yeah. Now you have to keep in mind, Jimbo and Saban are buddies. So this was sort of a lighthearted back and forth. I mean, Jimbo has said that he's guaranteed that they're going to beat Alabama, but I think it was at some like booster function, and what's he supposed to say? Oh, Alabama's going to kill our buddy.
I don't think we're going to do it.
I thought Nick Saban's answer was great. He goes, at golf? And then he went on to be typical Nick Saban, and they've got a great team and all that other kind of stuff. But he did. He kind of just giggled, and then he was like, at golf? It's about as savage of a response as you're ever going to see from Nick Saban. But
that's funny.
We do have to understand that's not like him and Lane Kiffin going at it. And Jimbo are good buddies. Jimbo was his offensive coordinator when they won the title back at LSU in 2004. So they're good buddies. That was more for fun. So now we can go to Patrick's question, because I thought he had some. This is a good question, a good topic of conversation.
We could do an entire podcast about this. So warning.
Maybe we should. Let me write that down.
That's going to say. He says, I feel like this could be the year that our past performances catch up with us, and a 12-0 Irish could get snubbed from the playoffs unless everyone else has 1 to 2 losses. And he continues on with, or the teams we play turn out to be way better than expected. So I'll put the original up there. That's interesting. And I don't think at this point that an undefeated Notre Dame team is ever going to get left out unless there's 4 other undefeated teams, which I just don't see happening. There's too many cross games being played and things of that nature. I just don't see that happening. If that ever does happen, then now Notre Dame needs to start talking about being in a conference. But I still don't.
Only if it happens multiple times. If it happens once, it happens once. I mean, it is.
I just don't see that ever happening. If Notre Dame's undefeated, they've beaten names, whether those names are down or not. They've beaten names because there's always going to be names on their schedule. and they're going to make the playoff. And because I also don't believe that there's going to be 4 other undefeated teams that you could put in ahead of them. So that's my opinion on that.
My thing is, I think that Notre Dame fans have to stop being so paranoid about this. The fact of the matter is, ESPN does not determine who makes the playoff. Otherwise, Georgia would have been in a couple years ago with 2 losses. Michigan would have been in over Notre Dame in 2018, right? The College Football Committee has shown time and time again, we don't care what you think.
Yeah,
ESPN spent an entire segment on how BYU was woefully underrated, and the committee never did anything about it because they don't care.
Yeah.
And our opinion that Notre Dame needs to go 12-0 is 100% driven by ESPN because there's no data to support that. And let me make my point, okay? In 2015, Notre Dame lost in October to Clemson, yet still climbed in the top 4. The reason they fell out of the top 4 is because their play was below standard. They played poorly against Wake Forest, who stunk. They played poorly against Boston College, who stunk. And that dropped them out. And then, of course, they went and got beat by Stanford. But a one-loss Notre Dame team was ranked 4th. No one's going to ever be able to convince me, because you have no data and I have no data, that if had Notre Dame gone out and pounded Wake Forest and Boston College and then beat a top 10 ranked Stanford team on the road, that they'd have been left out of the playoff. There's no evidence of that. In 2017, Notre Dame lost in September to Georgia. They climbed all the way up to number 3 in the college football playoff with 3 games left. They played at top 10 Miami. Then they played at a top 25 ranked Stanford team. You're telling me that a 3rd ranked Notre Dame team would have fallen 2 spots with a loss had they beaten a top 10 Miami team and a top 25 Stanford team on the road and their final 3 games? There's no evidence that would have happened. The committee doesn't do that. It wouldn't have happened. We have to get over this allowing ESPN to drive the narrative, because the one thing the committee has done a great job of is they don't care. There were people at ESPN pushing for Alabama to be in the playoff in 2019. Well, yeah, they lost 2 games, but they're still the most talented team, and their quarterback got hurt, but now that Mac Jones has some time under his belt, blah, 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 blah. Right? They don't care what ESPN says. They don't care what we say. They have a criteria, and they've been pretty consistent, in my opinion, with that criteria. So I don't buy it. I don't think Notre Dame needs to go 12-0 to make the playoff. If they're 11-1 and there's some 13-0 conference title teams, the fact is those teams probably deserve it more than Notre Dame.
And I get that.
Having said that, this notion that he says of past performances, then who are you going to put in? Oklahoma? Do you remember what happened the last time Notre Dame's had 3 big losses on the big stage, right? And that's in Brian Kelly's entire tenure. That goes back to 2012. They've had 2 playoff losses. They lost by 27 and 17. Those are not destructive butt whoopings, okay? Number one. But then you look at and say, okay, so what are you going to do about – so if it comes down to Notre Dame and Oklahoma, are you telling me that they're going to hold Notre Dame's postseason record against them? The fact of the matter is Oklahoma's an offer in the college football playoff too, and the last time they were in the college football playoff, they lost 63-28. The time before that, they lost by 11.
Yeah.
The time before that, in 2017, they were competitive. It was an overtime loss to Georgia, but then in 2015, they lost to Clemson 37-17.
Right.
So you can close. Look, Ohio State got beat 31-0 by Clemson in 2016. Made the playoff again in 2018 and lost to Clemson. Choked the game away. And they got back in this year despite playing like 6 games.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? The committee doesn't care about that. The committee does not care. Alabama should have got in 2019 if we're going to talk about past performances. You say, well, look, yeah, Alabama's lost 2 games, but if you put Alabama in the college football playoff, they can beat anybody. And that's true. But it wasn't about that. It's their resume right now. They don't deserve it.
Right.
And so I get that Notre Dame fans feel this way, but it's because of what you're being told. And you're being told it by people who have an agenda, and you're being told it by people who have no authority on who plays in the postseason right now. And the committee has shown year after year that they don't care what ESPN has to say. So, number one, there's zero evidence that Notre Dame has to be undefeated to go to the playoff. Again, 100% ESPN created a narrative with zero basis in fact. And somebody says, well, they've never They didn't get in with one. They've never had a one-loss team in the postseason. And if you really want to get technical, they made it this year with a loss.
They did.
The ACC title game counts as a loss.
Yes,
it's a regular season game that happened before the tournament. And they got embarrassed by Clemson. And guess what? They still made it in.
And that was the most recent. You talk about recency bias and all that.
They had a record that was sub 500. Their opponents were sub 500 combined on the season, despite having 2 games against Clemson on their schedule.
Right.
They had a sub 500 opponent record, and they still got in.
Yeah. Yeah, they want them. It is what it is. So.
Right. So we have to get rid of that. We have to get rid of the past performances and all that. That's not what the committee does. That's an ESPN thing. That's not a college football playoff committee thing.
Fair enough. All right, Kenny jumping in about Cone. He goes, I'm on the fence about Cone. I honestly have no idea what to expect. That's okay. Mm-hmm. Honestly, I'm okay with that because, we think we know what we're going to get, but we've never seen him in a Notre Dame uniform on a Saturday. So, or in a real game, I should say. Yeah, I'm okay with that.
I guess I would say, though, because Kenny's Kenny's been a part of the IB community from jump. So nice. Kenny's my guy. But Kenny, I'd want to hear from you why you're on the fence about him. I guess I can't really respond if I don't know why. I can make assumptions, but I don't think that's fair to you. And you usually give really good reasons why you feel a certain way. So I would say this: if Jack Cohn simply does what he did at Wisconsin, Notre Dame's going to be really good this year.
Yeah.
The guy completed 69.6% of his passes, despite playing against Ohio State twice, a top 10 Minnesota team on the road, and in the Rose Bowl. He still completed 69.6% of his passes. So, even if he just replicates that, I think he's going to be a pretty good player. And I think he'll have better talent around him. They had a great running back that year, but I love this Notre Dame running back field, and I think a lot better pass game weapons, in my opinion.
There you go. So he says D-Rock comes back with, I think Cohn will have a better supporting cast that could make him a solid QB this year, but Reese needs to open up the playbook. Not necessarily open it up. Just have a different one.
Yeah.
Or an alter.
I think what he means is just being more explosive.
I know.
Yeah.
Tom
bringing fire today, by the way.
Yeah, to your point, BK needs to allow the opening of the offense. And he's right. The buck stops with the head coach. There's no question about that. D-Rock agrees. Tom
jumps in.
He says, as long as we don't play in a hurricane on the road and try to throw the ball out of the gun 30 times, we should be okay.
That's savage. I love it.
That
would be reference to the 2016 NC State game where I'm in the stadium. The press box is waving. The stadium light poles look like they were doing that thing where Notre Dame does at the end of the game where they go like this. They put their arms around each other, and that's what the light poles look like they were doing during the game. We have flash flood warnings going off in the background while they're playing the game, and Notre Dame kept throwing the dang ball. So yeah,
and what got them beat that day was that punt, the block punt.
They missed. They had that. Plus, they missed a couple field goals because they didn't run the ball and get tighter and all this other kind of stuff. So yeah, it was pretty bad. Pretty bad.
Dylan says, interesting you say that, since one of the media outlets that did a top 10 matchups in college football this year had 4 Notre Dame games in it. I think there's no doubt if we're 12-0, we're in.
Look, if Notre Dame's 12-0, they're in. That's not really debate. It's more about, I think the other part of that narrative is the one that I really want to push back on, is notion that Notre Dame's somehow going to be penalized because of past mistakes.
Right.
I don't think that's going to happen. Clemson's lost 2 straight playoff games in a row.
Yeah, that's true.
And both were convincing whippings. LSU thumped them and Ohio State blew them out. So should we not have Clemson in this year?
Tommy says the only way a 12-0 Notre Dame team gets left out is if there are 5 undefeated.
There need to be 4
champions.
There only needs to be 4.
There only needs to be 4. You're right. Let's see.
Even then, if 4 and it's one of them's a Pac-12, I still don't think it's a given that Notre Dame would be left out.
D-Rock says we need to also dominate our opponents and don't let them hang around. Agreed.
That is something the committee looks at. That's just a fact. That is something they look at. How dominant are you against your opponents?
Right. Tommy agrees. Been waiting for that for 20 years. And Tom says, yes, no 12-7 victories.
Unless it's over Bama or Clemson. But no, to Tom's point, you shouldn't be winning games 12-7 in the regular season against teams with a losing record.
Right. John chimes in. He says, at some point this season, I want the second string in the game for the fourth quarter.
I think he meant third, I would imagine.
And yeah, that actually gets said here later on. Tommy jumps in. He goes, I want to see it early in the third quarter. And he says, even if it would be based on style points, I think we show a 2017 style of dominance like we did against SC, NC State, and Michigan State. Agreed. Okay.
David,
if you got one, go.
Yeah, David says, can you imagine having beers with Saban and Kiffin after the game? I bet that would be a nasty soiree.
I don't think there'd be a whole lot of talking, yelling.
Well, maybe. First of all, they're not having beers after the game.
No.
But I think a lot of that, though, is for fun. I think Saban knows how Saban gets what Lane Kiffin's shtick is all about. I think that'd be fun. I think that would be fun. D-Rock says, I think Saban made Kiffin cry several times. Okay. Brian Dembo. Hey, coaches, how balanced on both sides of the ball is the team this year? Is it the offense catching up on the defense?
Yeah, catching up on the defense.
I think that has to happen. Whether it will or won't, Brian, I don't know. I think that's what we're thinking it will happen. Look, if the Notre Dame offense and the Notre Dame defense are close this year because the defense takes a step back, Notre Dame's not going to be very good.
Right.
We're thinking the defense. Yeah, go ahead,
up
Vince.
Here, and the offense is trending.
I don't expect a drop off from the defense. If anything, I think the defense could be a tad better this year than it was last year for a host of reasons, including they have a full offseason this year.
Yeah, good point.
But it's about the offense. Can the offense catch up? We think it can. We're projecting it will, which is why we're having the show, but it needs to now prove it.
David wants to know, are there some O-line coaches out there that you would love to have?
I mean, yes, but they're not. It's not going to happen. I mean, look, the fact of the matter is Brian Kelly's not getting rid of – he's not getting rid of Jeff Quinn. It's just not going to happen. Jeff Quinn's going to be Brian Kelly's offensive line coach as long as Jeff Quinn wants to be Brian Kelly's offensive line coach. It's just never going to change. And we can complain about it and have all those frustrations we want, but the fact is it's never going to change. And then as we kind of talk about offensive line, Tommy Leonard said, but they had a year of coaching under Watt. Does that not count for anything with these guys? Not a whole lot, because it was just 1 year. He wasn't the primary offensive line coach. And part of what allowed Watt to be successful was he had other linemen that knew what the expectation and the standard was with Harry Hiestand. So I think that was part of it. I think Chris Watt coming back for year 2 would be helpful. But I don't think it's a situation where just because they had Chris Watt for a year, it's going to matter a whole lot. Plus, as of right now, at least 2 of the projected starters never played for Chris Watt. When you look at Kane Madden and Blake Fisher, and it could potentially, and if it's a situation where they move Patterson back to center and start Rocco and Cade Madden, then 3 of your starters never played under Chris Watt, much less Harry Hiestand. So certainly an issue. And to D-Rock's point about don't ever ask a coach about his team during the offseason on a golf course, I agree, which is part of the reason I didn't go today, to be honest with you.
Yeah, because it's all that he does this every year. You know, he has availability at his golf outing and all that. It's fluff. I mean, you're not going to get
every year. There's something he says where you're like, what?
Yeah,
and it never turns out to be true. It's like the guy's playing golf. Just whatever.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one.
Yeah. Tommy says, Brian, if Tua was a righty, do you think Miami drafts Liam when they do, if at all? Yeah, I think so. Because they wanted another tackle because they wanted to move Robert Hunt back inside. It just would have meant now their first round pick from last year would have been protecting his blind side, not the second round pick from this year.
Yep.
So yeah, I believe that they sort of taken him. You back to it, Vince?
I'm back, baby. So Kenny says we got to land Evans. That's probably in response to my rant about the corners and saying how important he was and all that. So I agree with you, Kenny. I am on board with that one for sure. And then D-Rock jumps in. Georgia offered Evans yesterday. See explanation further up. Yeah, we did talk about that, so that's good. Jack, watching the blue and gold game, I was very pleased with Cohn's performance outside of that interception. Yeah, the interception wasn't good. No question about it. But again, we talked about it. He's going to take some chances, and some of those chances are going to backfire.
Yeah, go watch the interception that Mac Jones threw early against Florida in the SEC title game. It was pretty terrible.
I'm hoping that this is sarcasm, but I'm not 100%.
No, he's not.
No, he's not.
He's being
Don't be silly. Notre Dame will never win it all again. Okay. Well, I hope you're wrong.
In the future, Vince, let's not put up comments like that because those people are all the time.
Okay, fair enough. I thought maybe he's being sarcastic.
No, he wasn't being sarcastic.
All right, and never say never. So that's a good response. All right. Here we go. Richard says, what was the difference in the playoffs? Bama had Smith. Irish need a dynamic player to step up at wide receiver. If they do, look out. And I'm not going to disagree with that, but I think there's plenty of candidates on this team that could take that role. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to be Heisman Trophy winning guys like he was, but there's guys that can take over a game.
Sure.
And I think that could vary from game to game as well.
I don't think that's the need, and I honestly don't think that's the only difference, because if Alabama would have only scored 17 points, they still would have won that game.
That's true too. That's a
I
good
mean,
point.
Notre Dame wasn't scoring on Alabama. And the fact is Notre Dame's issues were a lot deeper than just the talent they had at receiver. I mean, first of all, they had good receivers on that team. They were all standing behind Brian Kelly, first of all. Second of all, the kid who had been money for you in big games that year, Javon McKinley, you didn't even try to get him the ball until late second half, and then he makes a great one-on-one catch. I mean, and I also think that there were some issues in that game that went beyond just not having a big-time receiver. And I don't think if Chase Claypool would have come back for a fifth year, he didn't have one, but just hypothetically.
Yeah, right.
I don't think Notre Dame starts scoring a bunch of points in that game. I mean, they had Miles Boykin and Chase Claypool.
It's bigger than
and Alizé Jones and Dexter Williams on the same roster in 2018, and they scored 3 points against Clemson.
Right. It's bigger than one guy.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
No question.
They had Tyler Eifert in 2012 and he scored 4, and DeVaris Daniels and Ever Golson and Theo Riddick and Sierra Wood, and they scored 14 points against Alabama. It's a lot deeper than just – now, does that help, Richard? Yeah, I think so. Certainly it would help. But it's not like 2018 where I've said, look, you switch quarterbacks in that games and it's a different deal. Notre Dame wins. It's not a deal where if you switch Devontae Smith with DeVaris Daniels, all of a sudden Notre Dame wins. It's no.
Right.
No. Because they wouldn't have utilized Devontae Smith the way that they need to utilize.
Yeah, exactly. Dylan says Lawrence Keys has entered the chat. I think Keys will be this year what I think Coach thinks Bradshaw could end up being for Notre Dame down the road, maybe better.
I could see that.
Yeah,
I could see that. I love Lawrence Keys. He's a heck of a player. He needs to do what he needs to play to his potential. He needs to be more assertive.
Sure.
Part of this is on him. He needs to step up and make opportunities, but just be more of a guy. But then also he needs that opportunity, and he got it this spring. And it wasn't just the blue gold game. I mean, he played great in the blue gold game, but if he just would have played great in the blue gold game and we never heard from him all spring, I wouldn't have cared.
Right.
The reason the blue gold game is to be viewed in the way it is with him as excitement is we saw, a highlighted day. It was almost kind of like, okay, when's Lawrence going to be in the highlight with a big play?
Yeah.
I mean, you were looking for it every time.
Yep.
And to me, that's where I look around. That's what has me excited about him.
No question. Tom brings up special teams, and we've definitely talked about this. I know this has been kicked around here before, yes. But why is Notre Dame so passive on special teams, specifically the return game? We seem so passive, especially on punt returns. We refuse to put stress on our opponents. It's the philosophy. And they're very, and I believe Brian Polian addressed it during the spring. It's their philosophy. They are more worried about just getting the ball back to the offense, than they are about making a play on special teams. And
I don't even blame Brian Polian for that. I think that's a Brian Kelly thing.
I tend to agree with that,
and I think that's a mistake. I mean, and we see the same thing on offense. I mean, look, that's what we saw with a lot about Notre Dame. Don't make a mistake. Don't make a mistake. Don't make a mistake. And there became less of an emphasis on actually making plays. And I think that's a mistake. I think you need to have an aggressive. Again, aggressive doesn't equal out of control. Doesn't equal risk taking. I think they need a more aggressive mentality in every shape, form, or fashion. Look, here's the other thing. If you're admittedly not as talented as your opponents, and it's not my opinion, that's Brian Kelly's opinion.
Right.
If you don't have the talent of Alabama and Clemson and Ohio State, then you should even be more aggressive, because you can't just control the clock.
Kind of steal one, yeah.
Right. It means you're still going to lose by 17 or 24 points. Right. You're just going to lose 31-14 instead of 45-24 or whatever the case may be. But you're still not giving yourself a chance to win. If you want to win those games, you have to do some things to where, you know what, we've got to take some chances in this game. We got to get them on their heels. We got to get them off their game.
Yeah.
And we just haven't seen Notre Dame do that. And if it doesn't work, so flipping what? You didn't think you were going to win the game anyway. So take a chance.
Kenny says the issue holding Notre Dame back is quarterback play. We are catching up to everyone at other positions.
For the most part, I would agree with that.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well.
Yeah, and there's a couple corners got to still get a little bit better,
Sure.
and linebacker recruiting's got to get a little bit more consistent. But look what the class are about to bring in.
I was going to say, I think they're trying to close that gap a little bit.
For the most, with a couple little nitpicks, I think Kenny's spot on.
Yeah,
that's why getting Buckner was so important.
Yep. Tom says Kenny and I thought BK was the QB whisperer when he arrived at Notre Dame. I think there was a lot of that. I think, based on what he had done on his track record with quarterbacks at Cincinnati, at Central Michigan, even all the way back to Grand Valley.
Yeah, Kurt Ains at Grand Valley. And then he coached up Dan Lefevre his last year at Central Michigan, who I believe was drafted. And then it wasn't just like one guy, but it's like at Cincinnati, they kept having quarterbacks injured. And then the next guy would just come in and they'd keep winning. And I think that's where it came from. But their offense wasn't any great shakes at 2018 because of all those quarterback injuries. I mean, they were winning with defense that year, but then the next year those injuries benefited them because Zach Collaros got experience and Tony Pike got experience and all that. And then the next year they were outstanding. But then Tony Pike gets hurt, Zach Collaros comes in, and the offense was even better. Yeah. And then Tony Pike comes back in, and the offense is still really good. So, I mean, I think the reputation was earned. But look, the reality is, coaching Notre Dame is a different animal from a pressure standpoint on the quarterback. And I don't think Brian Kelly has ever found the happy place when it comes to how his involvement needs to be with quarterbacks. And there's already enough pressure on being the quarterback at Notre Dame just because you're the quarterback at Notre Dame.
Right.
When the head coach is making that even more challenging, then you're going to get a recipe for disaster, which is pretty much what we've seen for 10 years. And then, the most talented guys, I don't think they've necessarily coached up the right way. And it's been for different reasons. With Deshaun Kaiser, it was not holding him to accountability. With Phil Dracovic, it was just not coaching him, and Everett Golson, I can't really blame them for Everett Golson. I think his issues had as much to do with, because like one of the things that Kelly gets criticized for is he's too hard on quarterbacks. Brian Kelly was about as mindful of that with Everett Golson as he's ever been with a quarterback. Yeah. I mean, you could just see him like, okay, it's like Goose Fraba, before he got to talk to Everett. And he was not with Everett the way he was with Tommy Rees. I mean, him and Tommy Rees were kind of like him and Tony Pike. They kind of like just because I think that's the kind of mentality Kelly likes. Kelly likes a quarterback that's going to push
be
back
challenged. Yeah, no, absolutely. Right. I agree with that.
But at the end of the day, if the kid's not like that, but Tony Pike was the same way. But if the kid's not like that, you can't be like that. You got to understand who these kids are. And I think that's been an issue for him. But I don't blame him for Everett Golson. I think Everett's issues had more to do with him spending time with George Whitfield. So I think hurt him. And then him missing the year because of his own personal decisions. So that's one where I don't necessarily blame the staff for on that one.
Searcher Green says Saban just got a 3-year extension, putting him at Alabama from through 2028. I was really hoping he was close to retiring. Do you think he really coaches that long?
I'd be a little surprised by it, but I mean,
it's a long ways away.
Guy's still winning, and it's
you never know.
Alabama's a machine now.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
It's a well-oiled machine.
Back and just lets it. I mean, I'm not saying he's not involved. It's not like a Joe Paterno situation, but I'm just saying like he has it oiled, man, and it's going. That would be a tough thing to walk away from, especially you can pick up a few more titles and really cement yourself as the best. That's coaches want that, man. Paul says if Notre Dame makes the playoff, do you think that Jack Cohn will be the quarterback to take us there, or will somebody else step in?
Good, Vince.
I think that he absolutely can take Notre Dame to the playoff. And if the only reason he wouldn't be the guy to lead them to the playoff is if he gets hurt. I don't see him getting benched for his play. I don't see that being the case. If that does happen, could one of the other two lead Notre Dame to the playoffs? Yes, I believe that they could.
That would require, however, some of those other positions to step it up, just because of inexperience. Just because of
absolutely, no question. But yes, Jack Cohn can absolutely be the one to lead Notre Dame to the playoff, no question. All right, Jordan says, just on, will be disappointed if the Irish don't go to the playoffs with this roster and easier schedule, and Notre Dame is making big gains. I believe they've got the chance to win it all this time around. Go Irish. It's a good synopsis of basically what we've been talking about the last hour and 48 minutes, right? I mean, I'm with them. I don't disagree with any of that. All right, let's see here. Kenny says, I believe in Lincoln.
This is in reference to me asking him, about.
Oh, that's right. You asked him to respond to that about.
Because there's a couple things, but one was him not being high on Cohn, but the other one was, what he thought of Spencer Rattler.
Yeah, I believe in Lincoln when it comes to the QB position. Spencer is going to be great this year.
He's going to definitely put up great numbers. I don't know if that's going to make him the best quarterback. I think part of the reason Kyler Murray was the best quarterback was because he was phenomenal. I don't think that Spencer Rattler has Kyler Murray's talent.
Sorry, I was pre-reading this next comment. Dylan says he got the dad hat, the Flex Fit cap, soon to be a father later this year. So I'm upping the dad gear. Lots of New Balance shoes, high white socks, shorts above the knee, and flip-flops. Glad to support y'all. It's a great visual that you gave me right there. And I appreciate it. That is friggin' awesome. And then David jumps in. Don't do it, Dylan. You guys are awesome. I get a kick out of a lot of these comments. Jordan says, Georgia is a different team with an elite quarterback in JT Daniels. Who knows who they'll be this year? They could finally take out Alabama in the SEC championship. Georgia could be scary good. I don't disagree with that. Yeah. They could be. They absolutely could be.
JT Daniels is the only reason I'm even talking about Georgia in this show.
Yeah.
If it wasn't for JT Daniels and Todd Monken being the OC, I wouldn't even be talking about Georgia because they would find a way to lose. That's why I say, is Kirby going to be the reason they don't?
Yeah.
That's going to be my question.
Shannon says, guys, do style points matter this year in case Notre Dame slips up somewhere and ends up 11-1 or 10-2, and those losses are either blowouts or to bad teams, or will those losses trump any success even with 10 or 11 wins? I think style points always matter to a degree, and I think that there will be a debate about, or there'll be a discussion about, the margin of victory and who you beat. If you lose to one bad team and you have one loss, that one loss can be explained away to a degree. Sure. If you have
we've seen that.
That's different.
We've seen it. Notre Dame's Notre Dame's not getting in, and Notre Dame shouldn't get in with two losses unless
I agree.
Everybody else has two losses.
Not on this schedule.
And not with the title game to overcome it. It's not like you can lose two games and then go beat, so-and-so convincingly in a title game. No, they're not getting in with two. But to your point, Shannon, I do think with a loss, style points matter. I think the reason that Notre Dame jumped into the top three in 2017 wasn't just because they kept winning their games, but they were crushing people, and they were crushing good teams.
Yep.
Blew out a 10-win Michigan State team, blew out an 11-win USC team, blew out a 9-win and a ranked NC State team, blew out Boston College, rushed for over 500 yards against Boston College. I mean, Notre Dame wasn't just winning games. I mean, even the ugly wins were convincing. I mean, they didn't play great against North Carolina. Brandon Wimbush was hurt. Ian Book made his first start. They just played sloppy and still won like 33-10. I mean, they were destroying teams in 2017.
Yep.
So and to your point about style points, Shannon, style points is why they fell out in 2015 because they had ugly wins over Wake Forest and Boston College, who stunk. So I think style points, while Oklahoma was just smacking people that
exactly.
So if you're 11-1, no matter who you are, but I think to Notre Dame specifically, style points matter. You can't just win a bunch of games by 3 and 7 points and get in unless your wins by 3 and 7 points includes like 8 wins over ranked teams, or you have a reputation where you're Alabama or Clemson where you're just going to get in anyway with you have that kind of record.
Jordan says Oklahoma, as always, should crush the Big 12. And now that the QB has a year under his belt, I feel like ND has to go undefeated to get to the playoff this year, which I believe they will. And then he follows it up with, I see ND defense taking a notch up, not down, and expect the offense to take a big step. This is Notre Dame's year. He's on board, and I'm on board as well. I mean, I
don't think they have to go undefeated to make the college football playoff. There's no evidence of that. And again, half of their playoff appearances are with a loss.
Yeah, true.
I mean, there's just no evidence that Notre Dame has to go undefeated to make the college football playoff.
Right, and I don't see the competition around the country being so good that there's going to be so many undefeated teams.
There's not going to be 4 undefeated teams.
Right,
there's just not.
Yeah.
I mean, it hasn't happened yet. The closest we've gotten is 3.
Yeah,
I think, but it's just they don't have to go undefeated unless everybody else does, and I don't see that happening.
Right,
I just don't.
Tommy with some dad advice says, Dylan, don't listen to David. Definitely do it. I've even gotten a couple of dad bod T-shirts, and those are the ones I get the most compliments on.
Yeah.
Oh,
can we get off the dad stuff and get back to football, please?
Oh, no, not at all.
Yes.
No.
Yes.
In 2021, what of the top 10 teams has the hardest personnel matchup for Notre Dame? Personnel?
Yes.
Just from a straight personnel standpoint, I'm going to go with USC. I think they're going to have some serious personnel guy, but I'm not worried about the team.
You think USC is a top 10 team?
No, I'm not saying that. Oh,
well, that was the
I'm
question.
Sorry. It does say top 10s. I just looked at hardest personnel matchup.
Gotcha.
I
think that Clemson presents Notre Dame with a challenging matchup from the standpoint of they're going to have a great defensive line, and they could somewhat neutralize some of the advantages Notre Dame has in other positions if the defensive line dominates. But if Notre Dame's in the playoff, it's because the offensive line is better than we think it is right now. But I think also that Notre Dame has some similar advantages over the Clemson offense, which we saw last year. I think Georgia is a team that presents very unique challenges for Notre Dame because to beat Notre Dame, to me, the thing that has made Alabama sort of kryptonite for Notre Dame more than others is Alabama's always good in the trenches. Even though they have great skill players, they're good in the trenches. They're one of the few teams that can beat Notre Dame up front. Their offensive line was great.
Sure.
They were able to somewhat handle Notre Dame's front, not handle them, but like they didn't let Notre Dame's front four take that game over the way that Clemson allowed Notre Dame's front four to take that game over in the regular season. So I think Georgia is similar to that this year because they should have a very good offensive line. They should have a very big defensive line that I think if they're coached well and they allow that offense to play to its potential, they could present some challenges for Notre Dame. But I don't see that. But that's all kind of the part of the show is I don't see a lot of teams that present these huge matchup disadvantages for Notre Dame.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Jordan throws his the teams in the ring here who he thinks are going to be contenders: Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, Georgia, Oklahoma, Oregon, Notre Dame. Only 4 make it. Texas A&M, no way they're in this discussion, nor is Florida. All right. Interesting. Oh, let's see here. Got to scroll a little bit. Oh, that just all the way jumped to the bottom.
Right. And Jordan is correct.
Thank you.
Before you leave, hit the like button, and please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so that you get access to all of our shows and that you don't miss any of our shows.
Matt is jumping in. He says, can Notre Dame not just compete for a title, but win one in the next 2 years?
Yeah, that's the whole premise of this show.
Yes,
I mean,
they can.
Right. When I say compete for a title, that means winning it, right? Because otherwise you're not competitive. We're not talking about can Notre Dame make a playoff appearance again. To me, that's already been done. Just continuing to do that and losing, that doesn't mean anything. It's can they compete for a title? Yes. The whole point of the show, Matthew, and it's a fair question, is yes, I think this Notre Dame team can. Now, if they don't do it this year, but they build and they do some good things and then carry over some positive momentum into next year, let's say they lose a couple games in the regular season, they go to the Orange Bowl and they play, Georgia or Texas A&M or Alabama or Ohio State or somebody in the postseason and they win that game, then that springboards them with a chance to compete for it again next year. But I think this team – compare it to some of those other teams and what those teams have coming back, you say, okay, well, this is a down year for Bama. They're going to have a lot of dudes coming back in 2022. Bryce Young is going to have a lot more than 22 passes under his belt in 2022. Same with Ohio State. This is the year that I think you could have a chance to kind of sneak up and maybe take advantage of those teams not being at their normal full tilt elite selves.
Kevon said, I'd be fine with a 1-loss or 12-0 Irish missing the playoffs if they dub a highly ranked, recognized pro. I'm assuming in a bowl game. And then come out 22 hyped. Again, I don't think they're going to miss the playoffs at 12-0.
They're not. They're not.
And 11-1, they got a really good shot of getting in. So do I want them, if they go to a New Year's Six bowl, of course I want them to play a good opponent and win that game. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I kind of feel like it'd be a disappointment if they don't go to the playoff to a degree.
See, I don't know if I guess if they go 11-1 or 10-2 and there's like a loss in there where you're like, look, they were missing, kind of like the Clemson loss to Notre Dame. Look, Cone was hurt and Kyle Hamilton was out and, stuff happens, right? But then they come out in the Sugar Bowl and just beat the mess out of Florida or Georgia or, go to the Fiesta Bowl and just pound Oklahoma or something like that. I'd feel, to Kevon's point, I'd feel really good about going into next season. I'd feel better about that than going 11-1 and then going to the playoff again and getting smacked. I think at this point in time, Notre Dame needs to win a game at the end of the season. Yeah. And, if they go 11-1 and get left out, which could happen. They don't play a great schedule. It could happen. All I've said is they don't have to go undefeated. It doesn't mean every time they go 11-1, they're going to get in. There's evidence that they did get in once with one loss, and they would have got in another time with one loss if they would have handled their business in November. But if they go 11-1 and get left out, and that ends with them winning the Sugar Bowl or the Orange Bowl or the Fiesta Bowl over a legitimate team, right? Not like Coastal Carolina gets in like Penn State beating Memphis in the Cotton Bowl. I don't give a rip about that.
Yeah, right.
It's got to be, and I don't want it to be over a Big Ten team that's not named Ohio State either.
Right.
It's got, and I don't want it to be against Oregon. It's got to be Oklahoma, Ohio State, or a SEC powerhouse. It can't be LSU either, because been there, done that. It's got to be Georgia, Florida,
Recent
or
history,
Alabama.
Yeah.
To me, that's got to be it.
Yeah.
It's got to be, or Oklahoma or Ohio State. It's got to be one of those games.
Patrick says that's why I also said we need to beat everyone by a lot this year. A bunch of 10-point wins versus the schedule isn't going to help us. Again, that's only if they have a loss on the schedule. And
my thing is that flies in the face of recent history.
Yeah.
Notre Dame had a ton of ugly wins and a loss in 2020 and made the college football playoff.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's like that to me, that goes back to Patrick's thought that the committee's going to penalize Notre Dame for last year.
Sure.
Or not. Now, if Notre Dame's 11-1, they have to pound teams. But that's true of every team that's gotten in the playoff with a loss. Every one. You're not going to win a bunch of 12-7 games. Actually, the only team that's gotten in with one loss and a bunch of ugly wins is Notre Dame. Yeah. That's it. I mean, that's it. Their claim to fame was a double overtime win. They had a 12-7 win over a team with a losing record. They had a 14-point win over a Duke team with a losing record. Notre Dame had an 18-point win over a Georgia Tech team that had a losing record, right? I mean, they weren't blowing people out last year, but they still got in with one loss because they're Notre Dame.
Sure. Jack has an interesting question. He says, can Quinn learn anything from Watt? Yeah. I mean, sure. Look, I've learned stuff from many, many coaches that I've coached with, whether they were younger or older. Doesn't matter. You can learn. You can pick up a drill. You can pick up, just how to explain something to somebody. There's a million different things you can pick up from various coaches. And just because Quinn is old enough to be Watt's dad doesn't mean he can't learn something from him. So yeah, no question he can learn something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agree.
Yep. Omar says, even if everything breaks Notre Dame's way and we're a contender, how much playing time should Pine and Buckner get in order to be ready for 22?
Well, I think if everything goes Notre Dame's way and they're a contender, they're both going to get a lot of playing time because they're going to be blowing people out. Number one, regarding Pine, but I still believe I don't know if there's a bigger pro Jack Cohn person on the Notre Dame beat than myself. I don't know if there is. And that's not knocking anybody else. It just means I'm very pro Jack Cohn. Even then, I've said I want to see Tyler Buckner get an opportunity to play this year.
Sure.
I mean, so yeah, I want both of them to play. And if things break Notre Dame's way, I expect them both to
play a decent amount.
Decent playing time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. No doubt. Kevon says Bradshaw said himself at some workout he's interested in Notre Dame. I'd hate to see him walk because the staff doesn't put in the work.
If Notre Dame pushes for Xavier Bradshaw, they will get Xavier Bradshaw. If they don't get Xavier Bradshaw, it's because they made the choice not to. And that would be a mistake.
Yep.
That would be a huge mistake, in my opinion.
Dominic says every other program has had transcendent quarterback talent, and we just don't have that. Not to knock Book. He said, at least among the playoff teams.
I agree with you on the most recent Notre Dame teams. Agree with you wholeheartedly. I just have a difference of opinion when it comes to Jack Cohn specifically.
Yep. Matt says, is the new transfer offensive guard Madden taking over at guard when he comes in, or do you think Spindler will get the starting job? I think it's – why would you come to Notre Dame as a sixth year if you're not at least if it's not at least insinuated that you're going to have a shot at the starting job walking in the door?
Yeah, I think as we talked about in the show, the mailbag on Friday, and kind of hinting at what Kelly said today, could that mean that Rocco also starts and Kane starts and they move Patterson back to center? Possibly. Which kicks Zeke Correll out. It could mean that too. But if they keep Zeke Correll at center, which again remains to be seen, then it would most likely knock Rocco out or force Rocco to have to really beat this kid out, which hopefully, again, even if Caden Madden is as good as they think that he is, I'd still give Rocco an opportunity to get playing time this year. No question about it.
Omar says if the receivers aren't great getting off the line, not great route runners, take 4 years to develop, and as BK says, aren't explosive, what exactly is going on in the plus column in their evaluation, end of the year evaluation?
It's a great question. I mean, I wish I had the answer.
I don't think all of those are issues, though. Like, I'm not saying that.
I think a lot of them are. I mean, look, here's the deal: not getting off the line, issue. Almost across the board. Very few guys are good at that. Not great route runners. Issue across the board. Takes 4 years to develop. For the most part, issue across the board. And BK says they aren't explosive. He said that.
Well, he said that. Yeah.
So again, okay, so then why are you recruiting the same type of guys in this class, number one? But to the other point is, it's the same question we had at running back. Look, it's the same question we had at defensive coordinator in 2014 and 2015. I knew it. Everybody knew it. Notre Dame fans, Kelly knows what he's talking about, and Brian Van Gorder, this, that. Okay, well, look, I ended up being right about that, right? Autry Denson just didn't get the job done, and Notre Dame fans, well, top running backs don't want to come to Notre Dame anymore, except before Denson was here and after Denson was here, miraculously.
Right. Yeah.
That's been an issue for Coach Kelly. So all the good things he's done, it's things like that not having that sort of come to Jesus moment with a coach to say, hey, look, either you do it better or I'm going to find someone who can. And I maybe he did have that conversation with Coach Alexander. Let's assume that he did. But yeah, I don't see how he looks at that and says we have a player problem. I just don't get it. Because Dell's doing what Kelly wants. That's at the end of the day, that's the reality. That's all we can glean from it is if the coach isn't doing a good job, it's hurting the program. Kelly says it's hurting the program, then why didn't he do anything about it? Yeah. Because he doesn't take responsibility for it. It's easier to blame the players and say they're not good enough than it is to say, you know what, I made a mistake as a coach or one of our coaches made a mistake.
Let's see here. There's a question about Evans. I'll throw it up here. He goes, I asked Coach D about Evans on Twitter, and he wasn't worried about it. In your opinion, who is the favorite? Okay, don't see how Texas and Missouri compare to Notre Dame other than Evans being from Texas.
It's kind of a big thing, though.
That's why they're in the mix. I mean, but
it's also about, look at Notre Dame. He's going to have to compete for playing time. Do I think he'll start at Notre Dame? Absolutely. Do I think he was told he would come in and start at Notre Dame? No, because the difference at corner and guard is there's not a need for him at cornerback per se. They're just recruiting him because he's really good.
Yeah, right.
There's more of a need for Kane Madden from that perspective as far as the proven depth chart. So, whereas Missouri and Texas is like, dude, you're coming in and you're the best cornerback right away. Well, Notre Dame's, I don't know if you can necessarily definitely say, I think he would be, but that could factor into it as well, as there's not these open spots like there is at other places. So I think that's part of it. And I never said I wasn't worried about it. I've said all along that Texas and Missouri are going to be contenders. I just think Notre Dame is also a good player, is a good position here. And if he doesn't pick Notre Dame, which I've said could certainly happen, it's not going to be because they didn't do a good enough job recruiting him.
Yeah.
So I've never made it seem like they're definitely getting him. And I'm glad you're able to get in the show. I know we were chatting about this the other day, but I perhaps you misunderstood something or I typed something wrong. But on these shows, I've never said that it's a given that Caleb Evans is coming to Notre Dame. Never said that.
Final question here from Maddie. He says, ND could start Patterson at right tackle, right? Wasn't he recruited as a tackle or no? Could it be Patterson, Madden, Carell, Spindler, and either Lugg or Fisher? I don't think it's going to be Lugg or anybody. I think Lugg is in the starting line.
Lugg and Fisher are going to start.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They're going to
start. Now, going to start.
That could mean that Lugg plays guard, right, Vince? And then, he was recruited to play tackle. But look, I'm sorry to jump in, but Josh Lugg and Blake Fisher are going to start.
Yes.
And I don't know why there's this anti-Josh Lugg thing. Not anti, that comes across wrong like you dislike him, but there's just a lot of people that are just saying, well, maybe Lugg doesn't start. He's going to start. I mean, unless he's hurt. That's the only thing that could keep Josh Lugg out starting lineup is he gets hurt again.
Yep.
But as of right now, he's going to start. Blake's going to start. Jarrett Patterson's going to start. The only question is where do those guys play?
Yep.
I think that's the only question mark.
Yep. Could not agree more. All right. Anything else you want to touch
I'd say
on?
Brian Demos. Watching an Ohio State show yesterday, it got mentioned that recruits can meet coaches on their unofficial visits. Hope he misspoke.
You can.
Yeah, you can definitely can.
As long as it's not a dead period.
Yeah.
You absolutely can meet with coaches on your unofficial. No
That's
question.
Notre Dame was doing that.
Unofficial just means you're there on your own dime.
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't mean you can't.
The travel's
meet with
on your own
coaches.
dime, and he stays on your own dime, and they're very limited on what they can.
Because believe me, I have a lot to do with the summer camp situations at Notre Dame, and when guys come to camp, They're paying to be there. They pay to go to
Mm-hmm.
camp and everything, but they're the ones that are getting the rides on the golf carts with the coaches.
Right.
And they're definitely meeting with the coaches. There's no question about it.
And that's allowed. I mean, and that
100%.
happens everywhere. I mean, there's literally
100%.
pictures on the internet of Notre Dame meeting with 2023 kids from this weekend.
Yes.
So no, that's allowed. Yes, you can. The only time you can't meet with a player or have a face-to-face is during a dead period,
which is usually July.
Right.
Which is why coaches go on vacation.
Right.
They leave,
or for the 15th month period from March of 2020 to June 1st of 2021.
Right. Yeah.
But other than that, yeah. So they can. They can. All right, so that's going to do it for today's show. So before you leave, please hit the like button. Please hit the subscribe button. If you are listening on the podcast app and you would like to be able to ask questions or to be able to give to our program, then what I would encourage you to do is to check out the live shows. And the live shows are at 1 o'clock Eastern every day and during the week, and they're going to be that way for the foreseeable future. We'll see if things change once the season starts, but that is the best way to get your questions in if you're someone who does not listen live. So make sure that you do that. And of course, as always, check out irishbreakdown.com. So and below you have links to our website, links to the merch store, links to our where you can subscribe to the podcast, where you get the free newsletter, and our Patreon site. So appreciate everybody being with us today. Thanks, Vince, for joining us here on your first day of summer school. I just always, whenever I see a teacher summer school, I think of that old Mark Harmon movie. Remember that from back in the day?
It's a great movie where he grades driver's ed. And
yeah. So I always think of that when I think of summer school. So anyway, everybody, thanks for being with us today. Thanks for the great conversation. There's some disagreement today. There's some back and forth today.
Yeah,
it was really a lot of fun. So but we'll find out soon enough. Whether or not this Notre Dame team is in fact capable of doing what we think it should do, which is be a legitimate contender for a national championship this year. And by contender, we mean not just getting there and being competitive, but winning the game.
Yeah.
So again, we'll be back with you again tomorrow to talk some more Notre Dame football. Everybody have a great rest of your day.